So going back to your pastor, I mean, I think there's a pretty plausible naturalistic explanation to what happened.
I mean, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I just gave it, right? The intuition argument.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a very. I think it's a far-fetched example. I don't think it's one that's based on reality. And then not one that's been elaborated all that much. But I mean, we can move on. But if you want to elaborate a little more on it, I'd love to hear it because I don't really see a coherent explanation to how that took place. But you take that from a naturalistic framework. There's nothing that enforces at the end of the day. If I want to live well at your expense, what's telling me not to exactly?
Right. So I think it's intelligible to have system of morality again that are built or constructed.
But now you're in the
so
practical
I'm just gonna finish this point.
So does believing in a religion automatically make it true?
No.
Okay. Does believing in a set of morality automatically make it true?
If you mean literally true,
yes.
I don't think that's the right way of looking at morality.
Why not?
How can something moral be literally true if it's not objective?
That's exactly the claim. They can't be true if it's not objective.
Right, but I'm not claiming that they're objective. I mean, I guess the question here is why. I mean, again, if you have two accounts that both can't be true, why would your assumption be no, they're both right? I have to do research.
But I gave my answer to that is give me a bit of time to do research and I'll find you the reason why you said that is consistent with what they're saying. I don't believe that. I believe on first glance that appears to be a contradiction, but I'm rather confident there's a grounding reason behind it.
Right. So, but that's what I'm fishing for. If there appears to be a contradiction, why would you still assume that there isn't one? Okay. Hey everyone, Joe here. I'm pretty excited to finally publish this episode. It's without a doubt the most anticipated episode that I've ever worked on for a number of reasons. Probably mostly because of the substantial disagreements that were bound to arise during our conversation. So Casey's one of my friends from high school. I joked at the beginning of the conversation that he was merely an acquaintance, but he's obviously much more than that. Casey's a non-denominational Christian who I believe grew up Pentecostal, whereas I'm an agnostic atheist who considers himself to be a moral constructivist. As I said in one of my blog posts, Casey and I we've been enjoying talking about Christianity and moral philosophy for a while, and we ended up deciding to have a conversation together on my show, talking about those things. Casey's a skilled rhetorician and a decent polemicist, and in contrast, I believe that I have a little bit more knowledge when it comes to biblical scholarship, textual criticism, and the history of early Christianity, which made for an interesting dynamic. In preparation for this episode, I read a number of books by the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, including Jesus Interrupted, Misquoting Jesus, and Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium. Now, before commenting on the conversation a little bit, there's a few points I want to make. One, I spoke to Casey on the phone a couple of weeks before we recorded the episode, and I told him that some people fail to differentiate between having their beliefs attacked and themselves being attacked personally. And I told him that I believe that he could make that distinction. And I told him that for two reasons. One, I believed it to be true. And two, just to kind of remind him like, hey, I'm going to be attacking Christianity pretty hard, but I'm not attacking you, you know? Two, before we started recording, Casey was nice enough to ask me if he could, quote unquote, roast me throughout the episode. Obviously, not everybody's a huge fan of that, but I told him no problem. And so I'm only saying that because people that don't know Casey personally might think that some of the things that he said were a little bit rude. Like at some point he joked about me having 4 followers, which, I think might be a bit of an overstatement, but there was no ill will there. I don't like this, you guys don't have to misinterpret some of the things that he said. And finally, in case anyone thinks that I brought up really pointed questions, which I realized that, I did, Casey told me that nothing was off limits when it came to his faith. And so, I just think I put it out there. Now, for the most part, I really enjoyed the conversation. So, for instance, at one point, I asked Casey to react to a series of tweets by Sam Harris in which Sam attempts to prove that, or demonstrate that it is possible to derive values from facts. And Casey made a number of interesting objections and comments that I didn't really expect. And so you guys should definitely check that out. I wish I would have had time to talk about Jesus's apocalypticism. And so to say that Jesus was an apocalypticist is to say that he believed that the end of the world was coming and that the end of the world was imminent. And so it's actually, I think that idea deals a pretty devastating blow to the idea that Christianity is true, and literally true. And Jesus's apocalyptic teachings is actually one of the reasons that Bertrand Russell gives for not being a Christian. And so, it's too bad we didn't talk about that. One of the rapid fire questions that didn't come up also was Euthyphro's dilemma by Plato. It's totally possible that I butchered that name of Euthyphro's, but we were running out of time, and quite frankly, I was running out of patience towards the end. Between Casey's constant interruptions that remind me of Neil deGrasse Tyson's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast, and Casey's comments like, "What you're saying isn't very coherent." Yeah, it was getting pretty late, and I didn't want to say something that I would regret, and so towards the end, I kind of, bring down the disagreements, and hopefully I didn't do it too much, but I had to do it, a little bit. All that being said, I think Casey and I had fundamentally different ideas about the format of the episode. My goal really was to have a productive conversation with somebody that had a totally different worldview than mine, whereas he seems to have tried to win a debate more than anything. I wish I would have made my intentions clearer from the get-go, kind of like Sam Harris did at the beginning of this podcast with Omer Aziz. So it's Sam's podcast number 32, ironically titled The Best Podcast Ever. So at the beginning of that conversation, Sam tells Omer, "I'm not trying to win a debate. I'm not trying to have a debate. I'm just trying to have a conversation. I'm just trying to create a bridge of understanding," or something like that. And another maybe tactical mistake that I did was, at some point, Casey alleges that there were 10 original surviving copies of the New Testament. And I knew that wasn't the case because I had done some research and, read some books. And I ended up saying something like, "That's not right." And the week after, it's a little bit unfortunate, the week after we recorded the conversation, I began rereading Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And one of the things that he says in the book is, if somebody's wrong, you don't just tell them that they're wrong. It just doesn't work. Like, they're not going to be receptive to what you're saying. And so definitely things I could have done better. 2 things I could have done better. On that note, I actually worked really hard not to make Casey look bad on my show. So again, I wasn't trying to win a debate, and I didn't want to make him look like a fool on my show, which I don't think is something that is necessarily obvious from the episode alone. So to give one very brief example, I had asked some mutual friends if Casey had any favorite Christian apologists and if he had any favorite scholars, because I didn't want Casey to answer in the negative and make him look a little bit bad. Like, "Oh, okay, you don't listen to, you don't follow scholarship at all, do you, And I often say that Sam Harris has had a big influence on the way that I think. And one of the ways in which this is true is this idea that our ability to have meaningful conversations, especially when there are disagreements, is of the utmost importance. One of the reasons that I launched this podcast was actually to show people how to have more difficult conversations. I'm not going to pretend to be a perfect conversationalist, but I'm definitely trying, and I'm showing people how they should try. It's possible that the idealist in me was hopeful, maybe a little bit too hopeful, that this conversation would really be more of a conversation than anything. Throughout the episode, I was reminded of something that Sam Harris said in his introduction to his podcast with Ben Shapiro. He talks about this tension that he felt between the gracious podcast host that didn't let things get bogged down and the philosopher in him that couldn't let a bad point go. Now, that was definitely a viscerally real tension for me. I don't think that I struck the perfect balance, but I certainly tried. In any case, I think the conversation speaks for itself, and I do want to hear honest feedback from you guys, and so please feel free to comment in the YouTube section or on my blog. I want to hear from you guys. And yeah, props to Casey for coming on my show and talking about his beliefs for 3 hours. Not everybody has the courage to defend their beliefs like that in front of a camera for a while, and so thanks Casey, he's a good sport. And finally, so Casey ended up finding a website that claims to have reconciled the apparent contradiction that he wasn't able to resolve on my show, or that he said he would do some research and come back to me. And so you guys are going to want to check that out in the YouTube description. It's also going to be on my blog post in which I announced the publication of this episode. And there's a very good chance that I'm going to be writing a response to that reconciliation or, alleged reconciliation. So you guys are definitely going to want to check that out on my blog. And when I do write that post, it's going to appear in the YouTube description of this YouTube video. And so if it's not there yet, it's going to be there pretty soon. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. And so without further ado, please enter my conversation with my good friend Casey. Hello everyone, for a special edition of Truth Seeking with Joe. I'm your host, Joe, and I'm going to be interviewing an acquaintance from high school. I don't know why it says he's my friend here, but this is wrong. We recently reconnected sometime last year, and just along with some mutual friends. And Casey's one of the sharpest debaters that I know, which makes me equally excited and nervous for this conversation, because there's a lot of things that we disagree about. And I have a book here. It's basically, I don't want to brag, but it's a compilation of all the disagreements and debates that I've won with Casey. So
that's what we're presenting. It's actually like engineering.
So if I ever start talking about traffic lights at some point out of the blue, you guys are gonna know why. Put this here.
Oh my god! I just got out to what the traffic light. It's such a stupid. Anyway, don't worry about it. It's why are we bringing this up?
Yeah, we've had a lot of stupid disagreements over the years. I've won all of them, but they're all pretty stupid. So thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the introduction, and
I think we've been meaning to do this for a while, and obviously a lot of stuff happening in our personal lives, but I'm glad we were finally able to put a date down in the calendar and do it. So I think it should be fun. And so I was thinking maybe before diving into areas that we disagree, maybe we can start talking about stuff that we agree on, in particular COVID.
Oh yeah.
And so would it be true to say that you have strong feelings against the way that our institutions handled the pandemic?
Yes.
Okay, so could you give us some examples of the way that you think we really did a terrible job?
I don't think anything should have been mandated. I think people should have had the freedom to do what they wanted to do. I think stores should have had the option to stay open if they wanted to and take their own risk. I think that they should have, the one thing they could have done is protect the elderly and try to do damage control. You saw the virus in the beginning was targeting the vulnerable individuals, so they should have given them the option, not forced them, but given the option to be able to shelter in place. Like I remember seeing old grandmas on the OC Transpo because they didn't have a lot of money, crowded with a bunch of people. It's like maybe the government could have given a bit of money to them so they could Uber instead and be less exposed to it in their vulnerable state instead of shutting everyone down and destroying the economy in the process.
Right.
So yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people really lost their minds during the pandemic.
Yeah, I didn't know toilet paper would be so popular all of a sudden, but
yes, great modern example of panic buying.
I could see a lot of like hand sanitizer, food. Okay, I still don't understand the toilet paper. I still don't understand it.
Yeah, you gotta have TP, Okay, so there's a lot of ways in which our institutions failed us, and so for instance, mainstream media failed us epically. You had doctors like Robert Malone and Peter McCullough that were being forced to speak on alternative media like the Joe Rogan podcast. Social media like Twitter and Facebook, they were censoring conspiracy theories that ended up being true 90% of the time. Health organizations like the CDC that were unable to differentiate between people that died with COVID and people that died from COVID. So given all the ways that our institutions failed us, what changes or improvements do you think are necessary to better handle future health crises?
Where would it begin? This is such a complex question. I would honestly, like, there's part of me that's tempted, and probably rightfully tempted, to say tear it all down and rebuild it from the ground up and get rid of all the people that were in power to begin with. I think what you saw, principality, wasn't so much a failure, but a blatant corruption with people with their own political agendas taking over. You saw in terms of the medical association, it wasn't just a matter of incompetence, but direct deception. Deception would be the word I use for it. They should have lied to us in a lot of cases like that. I mean, there's the incompetence too. Like, for example, I remember one of the first things they said was the virus was waterborne. But I actually suspected at the very, very beginning that it was airborne. They didn't say it was airborne until the first 6 months. Because the whole if you remember, all the protocols at the beginning were based on a waterborne model. So the mask worked because it stopped the water particles. The distancing was based on the water particles. But if you look at previous coronaviruses in the past, they were all airborne. So why would we not assume this one could be airborne as well? The assumption at the beginning was waterborne, and then they corrected that 6 months later. So this is arguably one example of incompetence, or something that, in my opinion, they should have.
Right.
The lack of closing down the borders at the very beginning because we didn't want to be racist to China. That was another fun one. But yeah, just blatant deception. Like, one example when it came to vaccine was with the AstraZeneca vaccine in Quebec. So they released, I mean, you could argue that one was more negligence, but I would also argue deception. But basically, they released the AstraZeneca vaccine. They were pushing it in Quebec at the time, early on. And then at the same time, it got banned in Europe temporarily because they feared of some side effects related to the blood clots, which we now know they were causing the blood clots. Mm-hmm. At the time, that they shut it, that they had banned it, Quebec was still, under the Canadian government, was still pushing for it to be administered. So not only in saying, oh, it's completely safe, don't worry about it. So, well, this is banned in another country for safety concerns. Our country is saying, no, don't worry, take it, everything is good, don't worry about that. Then it ended up being there was a correlation, and they ended up weeding out the AstraZeneca model outside the market. So, which essentially is them admitting, hey, yeah, there was something sketchy about that specific vaccine. I would argue more than one, but at least they're willing to admit for that specific vaccine. So at the beginning, they're pushing that vaccine while being banned in another country, and then afterwards, okay, everything is, now we're going to weed it out, but everything's fine, trust us again. It's like, no, I think there was a lot of deception when it came to the government.
Do you think it's fair to say that the pandemic and the way that the government and the health institutions handled it, do you think it's fair to say that it brought out a lot of cynicism in people?
Even like skepticism?
Well,
like or people questioning the authorities?
Yeah, like, to me, someone that's cynical is someone that says, okay, well, you've lied to us before. Yeah. How do we know you're not lying to us again? Like, almost like pessimistic, right?
You see that in the political divide. That's why conservatives, I think, were a lot more pushing, or people leaning on the right were pushing back a lot more, especially near the end, with the people on the left who were a lot more for it, is because the left mentality, or at least in modern political times, you could argue that wasn't originally what they originated as, but at least nowadays I would make the argument that that's what they're about. The left is a lot more trusting of institutions with the right questions everything in regards to those institutions. And I frankly, as somebody who leans more on the right, would question it all the same. Why should I believe that politicians have my best interests at heart? I mean, look, ask the Canadian Indians and the American Indians how that went along. The stuff that our governments have done in the past, the way they've killed and destroyed people's livelihood in response to corruption, all sorts of things. Why would you believe they have your best interests now? It's like, I just, prove that you have my best interest, prove that you're doing good for me. But I'm not going to believe it blindly. I just don't think that's wise.
So you talk about the difference between the way that the people on the left and the people on the right reacted to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the reason for that difference?
Because our current political climate is, the right is a lot more diverse. So you kind of have a shift, at least in Canada and the United States. Democrats have gone completely leftist, where the modern right today is, I would say, arguably centrist, and all a mix of different political backgrounds. You see a lot, particularly in the States, where a lot of former liberals are now associating themselves with the Republicans and the conservatives because their values now align with what was traditional liberalism. Actually, back then, I probably would say I would consider be a traditional liberal or libertarian in terms that I believe limited government and more freedom for people to spend their own money how they wish, minimal taxes, minimal government infrastructure. So I definitely lean more to that. I believe in individual freedoms as well. Very strong on government should minimize the amount of laws they pass with some exception and let people run their own lives. But I say one of the reason people reacted the way is, well, I mean, and you could speculate a lot on this, but modern day leftism has dipped its toe into authoritarianship pretty clearly. They want to censor and tell people how to live their life. And so when it came to COVID, hey, look, it's a moral failure for you not to follow all these protocols. Let's dictate your life exactly how that should happen. And you saw it at the beginning of COVID and throughout COVID, you know, you had people getting ticketed outside for being outside alone. There was a dad, I believe it was Orleans, he got a ticket for playing soccer with his sons alone in the field. Bylaw was given the ability to detain people with power they didn't have. In Ontario at one point during the third lockdown, Ford wanted to give police the ability to detain people on the street, on the spot, without there being a prior reason. Police actually refused to adhere to this power.
Right.
So there was that. So you see a lot where government's like, oh cool, now we have power. Let's see how far we can use it and make these stupid rules and get people to follow them because we want to control, we want to tell people how to live their life. And I think modern leftists or modern liberalism and Democrats, you see a lot more of a shifting that if you don't agree with us, we don't accept that anymore.
So would it be fair to say that the left has swung way too hard on the left side of the political spectrum?
I think it goes beyond leftism. I think now it's just authoritarianship. It's the ability to, like, you know, you see it with censorship. If we don't like what you're saying, we're going to shut you down. You see it with, we're going to get violent. You go to a protest against any leftist, whether that be LGBT or any type of leftist protest.
Right.
Look at the rate of violenthood. Like, I remember there was one with the LGBT one. Actually, there was two recent ones, but there was one that was by, what was his name? Billboy Chris. I was present there on the debating on the side against the ultimately protecting kids. That was the intent for most of the protesters there that were protesting against it. We were just tired of getting pushed on kids. But what you saw was, in terms of violence being committed, I think there was 3 or 5 arrests, all being on their side, none of it being on the conservative side or on the anti-brother side.
Right.
You saw also, I think there was at the Story Hour in Ottawa, there was one arrest. That I witnessed it actually. It was a guy who stole one of the Canadian flags, I believe from Josh, and broke it. And then,
so that was the drag queen story hour? Okay.
The protest of the day was one drag queen hour, and that wasn't the only conflict that happened, but it was the only charge that, I don't even know if the guy got a charge actually. I think Josh wanted to charge him on what I was telling him. But essentially he took, it was definitely a crime. He took the flag and broke it and got chased down by cops and handcuffed. So that was at the very least criminal mischief and arguably disorderly conduct. But all that to say is you look at these protests, or at least the last 2 of them, and the violence is coming mostly from the left. Why? Because the left has entered an authoritarianship mindset, which is you don't do as we say, you don't believe what we do, we justify acting violently against you. And you see it a lot more in podcasts too, where now they're outright justifying violence. They're saying, yes, because you're committing violence on us by spouting these hateful belief systems, we're going to justify getting violent towards you.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a really unfortunate perversion of words that's happening where people are going to equate words to violence. So they're going to start talking about like microaggressions. And if you feel like you're actually being, if someone actually being aggressive to you, then, I mean, in your head, maybe you'll think that it's going to be reasonable to react in kind. And then that's where you see the rise of Antifa and Black Lives Matter riots.
Well, that line is drawn differently too. In the conservative mindset, at least for the most part, more I would say most conservatives will agree on it. The line of what violent speech is direct encouragement or threats of violence. If you are not telling me you're going to hurt me or you are not encouraging others to hurt me, that is not violent speech.
Right.
That's I believe, in my opinion, falls under protected speech. I don't care if you look. I'm Jewish, okay, so we definitely have a bit of a rough hand when it comes to racist thoughts against us. I think we're one of the most hated racial groups, or one of the most targeted racial groups. Statistically, I think that was the case in the U.S. I could be wrong on the modern statistics, but from what last I heard, then that was the case. I think if somebody says I agree with the Holocaust, or somebody says, I don't like Jews, or somebody said the Holocaust, and I don't think the law should interfere. I really don't. I believe that it should be protected under freedom of speech, despite how abhorrent I think that is. Obviously, as a Jew on the receiving end of that, I think that's abhorrent. And obviously to any other class of individual, if somebody says something like that. but I still think it should be protected speech. Where if he's saying, okay guys, let's all gather together and kill the Jews, no, that becomes threats of violence at that point. I think then you have a legal parameter to act.
Right. Yeah, I don't remember who it was. Maybe Voltaire. Somebody once said, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah, it's a common saying when it comes to free speech.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think that really encapsulates the classical liberalist view, and I think it's kind of funny. You've got people that call themselves classical liberals, like Jordan Peterson, being painted as gateways to the alt-right. And like he considers himself to be liberal, and like maybe he has some beliefs that he agrees with conservatives, but I don't think anybody should be a slave to their party's beliefs, and so yeah, I don't know. That's the world has just gone mad.
Oh yeah, the things definitely shifted politically. Well, nowadays it's gotten so extreme that if you're against I'm going to bluntly say castrating kids realistically, but if you're against transitioning kids, you're considered an extremist. It's like, okay, and this is not a very popular view. I would say even the minority of leftists actually believe this. A lot of pushback. That's why you see these mass protests happening in response to this. A lot of people disagree with transitioning kids, even those that are on the pro-transgender side, because they're like, no, kids are too young to make these type of decisions. Like, we should wait it out a little bit, especially with the high rate of regrets that you happen afterwards, and the fact that they're kids, they don't really know what's going on at this age.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not wise to bring these transitioning at these young kids, and that has become controversial. People have been blocked, banned from. That was the case in with Call of Duty. The guy got his skin removed for saying stop going after the kids. It's like, this is now considered an extremist opinion. If you believe that you shouldn't castrate kids, you're now an extremist to the eyes of the leftists. It's like, okay, well, how does that exactly enable dialogue?
So when you say castrate kids, what do you mean exactly? I mean, I'm sure nobody out there is for castrating children.
Well, I mean, transitional surgeries, which is cutting off kids' penises in some cases, or remodeling it.
Right.
So, or hormone treatment, which is also castration.
Yeah.
And yes, these effects are long term. No, you might buy into the political nonsense that these are reversible. Anything in the modern science will tell you it's not.
Yeah, I think one of the points that, not to appear too conservative, but one of the points that Matt Walsh makes in What is a Woman is specifically that is he talks about, he calls it chemical castration. And it's like, yeah, if you inject kids with, hormone replacement therapy or whatever, it's like, I mean, some of the drugs that they use, they're the same drugs that they're used to, given to sex offenders to castrate them, like for the sole purpose of castrating them. And so, obviously some people might disagree with the language that you're using, but I don't think it's incorrect to say that, yeah, like those types of procedures are equivalent to castrating kids at the end of the day.
Well, I'll make a quick note on that. The reason people are offended with some people might be offended with my language is because I'm not using euphemism when I'm talking about these type of things. The reality is I'm speaking plainly about these things because what I'm saying is accurate. It's just not euphemized in a way to soften the conversation, because I don't think it should be softened. I think that we should rightly call this out. I think it's horrid somebody castrating kids and putting 8-year-olds in hormone therapy. I think it's horrible. I think people like that should be in prison for the rest of life, if not executed, if you believe in the death penalty. I honestly think it's horrible. Kids should not be going through this. Kids should not be put in a position where they either want to detransition or they're taking advantage of their young, influential mind, because kids are very influential. Most people now volunteer with kids, but I used to work with them particularly, and I can tell you can influence them very easily, and to influence them that way and to destroy their lives in that way, I just find it abhorrent.
Right. Do you think there's a difference between sex and gender?
I was just about to say absolutely, but then I paused on your question. I
won't be offended.
No. I'm trying to answer this because I don't really know anymore what people mean by gender, and it's gotten so this is the thing I find puzzling with the transgender movement is if gender, the argument is gender is a social contract. If it is a social contract, why is it relevant? Why is it so important? Social contracts are supposed to be based in irrelevant in most cases. Like, at the end of the day, what matters? What matters is your biological sex. What matters is what does a biological sex means. It means that you look different, that you have different advantages. In the cases of males, we're strong. Generally, we have the capacity, would be the accurate way to frame it, to be stronger and faster. So it doesn't mean that all males are stronger and faster compared to all females, but it does mean we have the ability to get there in most cases, or if not all cases. And if you look at the stats of competing competitions, you greatly see that in the physical criteria is men dominating those spaces with rightful reason, because we have the capacity to go higher. But we also have psychological differences. Women tend to be more nurturing than men, and the way the brain functions and the way what strings the desires and so on, there is a biological distinction there. Now, some males have exceptions, some females have exceptions, and you see some cross-reference, but you do see in a statistical aspect, and you even see in a psychological aspect, that the way the brains operate are different. Now, what you make it out of gender, like, it gets complicated. Like, what should women and men wear? I mean, there's a social aspect to it too. There's a culture aspect. You know, depending on the culture, depending on what's appropriate. You know, certain cultures like kilts, for example, in the Irish, the Irish culture, you know, would not, if not recognize the culture, you would kind of look at it odd in Canada, for example, in the United States. So there's definitely a culture component there. I think that we, even as conservatives and Christians, I think we make the mistake of being overly harsh on gender norms. Like, I remember talking to a girl that was very conservative mindset. She's like, oh, as a mom, she's like, oh, I don't want my son to be feminized. You know, he's supposed to be strong. He's not supposed to like show emotions. I'm like, that's not masculine or feminine. That's just stupid. It's like men have emotions too, and if we were like, you can talk about how men have more trouble in general expressing their emotions. I know that's true for me. But I think if males, we were smarter, and if we had a culture that was actually healthy for males, we'd encourage more of the emotional element. Because I think being a man in a fundamental aspect, it's about character more than it is about being strong and the bravado and all that nonsense and the arrogance and stuff like that.
Right, the machismo.
Yeah, well, you kind of see it a bit with what's his name, with Andrew Tate. You know, they want to go on the macho side of male, what it means to be a man. I don't think that's what it means to be a man. I think that's dumb. Like, he talks, there's some things he points out in psychology, which is true. There's other things where, like, the end goal of it is like, okay, not necessarily. Like, especially going at it from a Christian perspective, I think being a man is about character. Being brave is about character. Standing up for what's right, it's about character. It's not so much about, I mean, I have the biggest muscles at the end of the day, but what does that matter, really?
Can you do me a favor?
Sure.
So I don't have the setup that I would like to have. Ideally, my microphone would be hovering above the table, but because it's not, like, whenever we're like banging on the table, like, the noise spikes.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you could just be mindful, like, I'd really appreciate it. Bang! So I think that, I mean, I haven't listened to much of Andrew Tate. I haven't seen much utility in listening to him, but obviously he's had a profound influence on the world, and, you know, he's been on Tucker Carlson's show twice, or, you know, maybe not his show, but, you know, he was recently interviewed by Candace Owens, and, like, he's making some waves in the world. And I think, you know, if I had to give a charitable interpretation of his ideology, it's that being a good man is to be successful. And obviously his brand of success is, you know, luxury cars, women, big house, big, you know, everything. So I think you can kind of separate the, you know, luxurious look of his life maybe, but still kind of see that, okay, it is useful to be successful. It is useful to stand up for what you believe in. And yeah, but again, like, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that, you know,
well, there's good and bad in what everyone says, and then to what degree, right? Like, with Andrew Tate, first of all, I think when it comes to personal successful finances, I definitely think there's wisdom in how to manage finances, but I also think that power is not necessarily completely the control of the individual. I think power can shift very easily. You could tomorrow be sick and not be able to work, and then what? You know, is your self-esteem, is who you are as a person measured by your ability to produce, when outside of your control, you're no longer in a position to be able to do that. I think people are really overconfident in their own ability to do things, not realizing that every breath we have is a gift from God and can go in a second. But Andrew Tate, for example, one of the things that I take an issue with is, I think he is, I don't think he's racist by any means, but I think he's misogynistic. I think that he thinks women are inferior to a degree that's not realistic. Like, there's a comment off the bat of my head where he's saying that he doesn't trust women to be pilot because he doesn't think they're competent to be pilot. There's nothing about the biology or psychology between a male and a female that would determine a female's inability or ineffectiveness to fly a plane compared to a male. nothing in our psychological differences or physical abilities would make a difference when it comes to that. So I think that just is bravado thinking that he's superior to women. So I do think he's misogynistic in that sense. I think objectively that could be said about him, and I would disagree with that element of him. There's things he says about psychology is true. A lot I really have to go back and like examine piece by piece.
Right.
But in general sense, there's things that he says that I agree is true. I think what he says about the government for the most part is also true. Obviously, I have a lot of agreements with that, but doesn't mean I agree with everything he says.
Yeah, no, he's definitely an interesting figure.
I'd definitely say he's definitely not a Christian role model.
Oh no.
Okay, that's more not in any sense.
So what does it mean to be a Christian role model?
Are you endorsing the Christian values? Right. Obviously, no one is perfect, right? I'm not trying to say that, but what I'm trying to say is that when I say Christian role model, he's not, for all the Christians who look up to him, he doesn't embody Christian values. He doesn't promote Christian values. You know, when he's saying, oh, you know, like you want to be rich, you want to get the girls, you want to sleep with several girls, none of that is biblical. You know, the Bible teaches, for example, it belongs in the context of marriage between a man and a woman. So there's obviously a core disagreement when it comes to that.
Right.
There's a core disagreement when it comes to what are you pursuing? You know, we're called to pursue God. And yes, wealth is a good thing, and we're supposed to be generous and kind with that wealth, but it's also not the measurement of the character of man. God might if you're being obedient to God, he might call one man to have almost nothing because of, like, say you're going to ministry or going in, say, a missionary trip to, say, Africa or whatever, you probably won't have much on your back and taking care of people, and you might have one where you invested much wealth to take care of others. At the end of the day, I don't think wealth is a measurement of accomplishment. I think it's a good thing. I think it's definitely, I think comfort is a good thing, is a blessing of God, but I don't think you can measure success and accomplishments by that. I think from a Christian side, the world can measure success whatever it wants, but from a Christian thing, I think it's inconsistent with the message of Christ.
So there's more to living a good life than just material stuff.
Absolutely. From the Christian worldview, the measurement of success is being the obedience to God. It really comes down to that. It's not about how much you have or how much you do. It's about, am I doing what God is asking me to do? That's obviously, if you care for the Christian perspective, that's what it is in regards to that.
Right.
So it's a different way of seeing life and a different pursuit of what you value in life.
Okay. Let's see. So religion came up a couple times.
I know it's gonna come up more.
Yeah, no, it's.
I got a few spoilers of what he's gonna throw in.
Right. Okay, so I'd like to bring us back to COVID.
Okay.
So I'd like to talk about your understanding of COVID in light of your faith. So maybe we can kind of start from the basics. So what do you believe in terms of religion? And yeah, we'll start there.
So basically, just a brief summary of my faith. I'm a Christian. I consider myself non-denominational Christian for the simple fact that I don't base my doctrine on a specific denomination. I believe in the Word of God. I believe in the Scriptures as the Word of God. I believe in the Spirit of God. I think God is alive and acting today. And I do agree with probably what a lot of other mainstream denominations, like I'm right now going to a Pentecostal church. I used to go to the evangelical church, so my beliefs do align a lot with these things. But I don't, if Pentecostal teaches one thing, it's not necessarily what I believe about the Scriptures. I like to be the one to believe, to interpret Scripture the way I interpret Scripture. In other words, I'm not going to let a doctrine determine what I believe about God. I'm going to let God determine what I believe about God. Put it that way. Yeah, in regards to that, I don't know what else to add to that.
No, that's good. That's good. Are there any specific biblical teachings or passages that you find particularly relevant or comforting in the context of the pandemic?
Yeah, that would be the words of Jesus when he says, which one of you by worrying can add a single hour to their lifespan? Basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's these passages in Matthew, I believe, where he's talking about how his disciples are worrying about food and water and the survival and even their own physical safety. And Jesus is saying, okay, what's all this relevant to? He's like, don't you trust that I'm God, that I can take care of you? Why are you worrying about these things? Why are you worrying about your life? Why are you worrying? Well, life can go like a vapor like that. Ultimately, as Christians, we have the hope that there's something bigger than us. We have a hope that there's paradise awaiting for those who put their trust in Jesus. So that's what keeps us going in that aspect. But what that passage is essentially talking about is that Stop worrying about being fed. Stop worrying about being clothed. Stop worrying about your life. He's like, God will take care of these things. He's like, worry first about seeking the kingdom, and these things God will deal with these things.
Right. Okay, that's good.
Also, I would add quickly, also when it comes to fear, I don't believe God calls us to live in fear in COVID. I guess it's the one, like the direct message I would make to Christians, or any potential Christian that might be listening to this in regards to COVID. And I take huge gripe with the churches that have bowed down to this. I think it's cowardice. I don't believe God called us to either enforce these restrictions or to bow down to them. I believe what God called us is to live without fear in this season, to not be afraid for life when it comes to a virus, and to treat people with love and respect. If somebody, you could make the case that if somebody wants to live by these protocols and you want to try to reach them, that you're submitting yourself to that to try to win their heart. Okay, I could see that maybe in that circumstance. But I don't think as a Christian we should be expecting that from other people. I don't think as a Christian, if you're saying to your neighbor, hey, I feel more comfortable with you wearing a mask around me, I don't think that comes from God. I don't believe that's biblical.
Okay. Have you ever heard of Dennis Prager before?
Yes. You've asked me this on the
okay.
But yes.
Yes. Okay. So basically, before we started recording, this exact point came up, and I brought up the fact that Dennis Prager, when he was being interviewed by Dave Rubin and Michael Shermer, was on his show as well. Prager reminded the audience that fear is the beginning of wisdom. And so what does it mean to say that God doesn't want us to live in fear if in the Old Testament it's claimed that fear is the beginning of wisdom?
Because the question is not living in fear, and fear is not the same thing. And the question is not a question about fear, it's a question about what are you afraid of. When he says that fear is the beginning of wisdom, actually the full passage is that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
It's to say that you reverence to God, you understand that you don't want to go toe-to-toe with God, you don't want to go against God because, there's a wise aspect to that, right? Why would you want to go head-to-head with the creator of all the universe? That seems like a losing battle in one retrospect.
Right.
Assuming that you believe in a God or God is actually there, that would seem kind of like a dumb thing to do. But that's kind of the sense of what is being said there. When I say live in fear, what I'm talking about is that we're afraid of the world, or we're afraid of losing our life. You know, the Bible says, don't be afraid of what can destroy the body. Don't be afraid of the one that can destroy the body, but cannot destroy the soul, but fear the one that can destroy both body and soul and send it to hell. In other words, don't be afraid of the world, don't be afraid of people, don't be afraid of circumstances. Be afraid of God and trust in God that He's more powerful than everything around you. And that if it's your time to go, there's nothing you can do about that. But if you're a Christian and it's not your time to go, they're not going to touch you. Because God is very much able to keep you safe if He wants you to.
Right, okay. So some fear is okay if it's fear of God?
You should... It's not that fear. Again, when it comes to living in fear and being afraid, afraid is a mechanism of protection. So, for example, if I'm somebody comes in with a gun and I'm crouching for cover, that's a survival mechanism. Living in fear is, I guess, in a biblical sense, you also have. We were talking about it earlier about the sin of cowardness, which is allowing your fear to stop you from doing what's right. So, for example, if God calls you to evangelize to people, and you say, okay, well, I'm too afraid of the social consequences, I don't want to do that. Well, the Bible calls that the sin of cowardice. You're being a coward. Our world knows what cowardice is. The church world tends to ignore it, but the Bible calls cowardice a sin, which is because you're allowing fear to stop you from doing what God has called you to do. So in that sense, yes, fear is a negative thing. I think it goes back to, I think we're called to be afraid of God, and I think we're called to be afraid of what God calls us to fear, and not be afraid of things God calls us not to fear.
Right.
I think it goes back to that.
Would it be fair to say that that's more of an Old Testament ideology, or just a biblical ideology in general?
About fearing God or not fearing God?
About fear in God being the beginning of wisdom.
It's both.
Both, eh?
People think that the Old and New Testament are in conflict with each other, but they align with each other perfectly. The same God, the God of the Old Testament is the same. The Jesus of the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament. Everything you hear and say from the God of the Old Testament is Jesus. We like to look at Jesus and go, this is a rebranding of the Old Testament God and a nicer version in the person of Jesus. No, this Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. and everything he says in the new aligns with the old.
Would it be fair to say that the God of the Old Testament is more wrathful than the God of the New Testament?
That's a perspective, but no, I would say that's inaccurate. Because even the God of the Old Testament is described by it as being rich in mercy and slow to anger. What you see, keep in mind, what the New and Old Testament emphasize in terms of scripture, the Old Testament talks a lot about God's judgment, where the New Testament talks a lot about the introduction of grace. So some people get the concept that it changed. But the New Testament is very clear that the wrath of God is still a thing. Mm-hmm. That God is very much still capable of dealing with injustice on the world, and that he will deal it in the end times, and to be fearful in reverence to God, while at the same time pursuing a relationship. And even the God of the Old Testament, there's scriptures that are very clear. Like you look at the relationship with David. Look at what screw ups David did, sleeping, having a man killed to steal his wife, and all the things that he's gone through. And yet he was called a man of God's own heart.
Right.
Where you see that patience and mercy and love and grace and compassion, and that, okay, you're my people, I'm going to walk with you, I'm going to, there's a verse in the Old Testament where he's talking about the people of Israel, and the Israelites who were constantly disobeying him and worshiping idols and even sacrificing their children, and doing all sorts of abhorrent things between each other, and God's trying to reach him, and just not listening, and he's like, God's like, you see in the scriptures reflected where God's like, okay, what do I do with these people? Mm-hmm. And at one point God says, come, let us sit down, let us reason together. And your sins which were red as scarlet, I'll make as white as snow. It's always fascinating. It's one of my favorite verses where God's looking at a broken people, a people that has clearly don't deserve God, have clearly walked away from God, and he's like, come and sit down and let us talk. Obviously you're wrong. Obviously I'm right. I'm God, you're a human being. But I still want to sit down and have that conversation with you. I still want to reach out to you. And yet people want to paint that as a God that's completely distant and harsh and just... I don't think that's accurate. I don't think anybody who really understands both the scriptures, I don't think they can honestly come to that conclusion.
Okay. So let's look at the story of the adulterous woman in the New Testament. So it's my understanding that this adulterous woman is brought to Jesus, and the guards or whatever, the people that are dragging her in the church, they say, okay, look, Jesus, this woman has sinned. What should we do with her? And the way that I understand the verse or the story, that the question is kind of meant to be a trap, and that Jesus either has to say, okay, well, let's stone her, like it says in the Old Testament, which would, go against his teachings of love and mercy, or he might say, let's forgive her, going, in accordance to his teachings of love and mercy, but going against the teachings of the Old Testament. And then he starts... the story. He starts writing on the ground and says, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. And so how can it be said that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament is the same if those guards were laying down a trap in Jesus's teachings and the morality of the Old Testament?
I feel this story goes back to the heart of the gospel, and it separates what should be done and what is being done. And it goes down to, so you take the message of the gospel, which the message of the gospel is that we're deserving of hell, we're deserving of death because of our sin. That's what should happen to us. We should be judged for it. What's the grace of God is that God, this being just, who has to go along with that, instead decided that instead of making these people suffer, instead of making these people pay their sins, which is ultimately the separation for me, I'm going to go in their place and pay it for them so that they don't have to. And anybody who puts their trust in me, I will give them the ability to become my son and daughter, and I will not hold what they did against them, not because I'm letting it go without being paid, but because I've already paid it. So when you look at the story of the women, and started saying, well, doesn't the law say this? Yes, the law says that. The law says the woman is being stoned. So why didn't Jesus stone her? Well, what does Jesus say? The first thing he says is he questions all the people judging, and he says, which one of you are in the position to judge her? And it quickly becomes apparent that none of them were, that they were all sinners just like her. So then they walked away. And then when he goes, he looks at her, he says, does no one condemn you? She says no, and he says, then neither I condemn you. But the only reason he was able not to condemn her is because he was on his way to Calvary, ready to pay the price for her, so he didn't have to. That's the message of the gospel, and that's the alignment between the Old and the New Testament. It's the same thing. Actually, a story in the Old Testament, a lot of people find this controversial, but a lot of people don't understand it. I didn't understand it until fairly recently. was when the story of Abraham, when Abraham was to sacrifice his own son, when God asked him, I want you to put your son at the altar.
Mm-hmm.
And Abraham knew that that son was going to come from that son of descendants, so he knew God wasn't really going to kill him, or that God was going to resurrect him. And in the scriptures you actually see that Abraham is reasoning this, it actually says this. So he goes and he brings it to the mountain, and right as he's about to sacrifice his own son, God stops him. He says, stop, Abraham, I will provide. And the mountain is called the mountain, I forget the actual name of it, but it means to provide.
Mm-hmm.
And God brings him a goat instead, and he finds a goat in the bushes and sacrifices that instead. But what that story is a not so much a forethought, but a foreshadowing of what's about to take place. And God is essentially showing Abraham, look, a sacrifice needs to be made, and it needs to be a son. And when he was asking Abraham to sacrifice his son to show what needs to be done, he stops Abraham and says, stop, I will provide. Because what Abraham didn't realize at the time was God was going to provide his own son, the person of Jesus Christ, in the place of the altar, because a son did need to be sacrificed, but God was about to offer up his own so that we didn't have to offer ours.
Right. But going back to the story of the adulterous woman, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, do you deny that there's a difference in morality between how the Old Testament might treat the adulterous woman and how the God or the Jesus of the New Testament would treat her?
Do I deny? Do I say there's no difference? There is no... The same heart is in both.
Mm-hmm.
The same heart of the God of the Old Testament is the heart of the New Testament. There's no distinction in that.
Right. But it seems like if Jesus would have followed the laws of the Old Testament, they would have had her stoned. And yet, he was teaching love and mercy. And
but
so
who
he didn't
says they followed the laws of the Old Testament to the letter? Or who says they were called to follow to the letter? And who says that there wasn't justice in the New as well? I mean, doesn't he say that about the soldiers? He says they're God's instrument for wrath. What's the full verse basically? Basically they're doing the will of God. They're not giving the sword in vain.
Sorry, what are you asking?
There's a verse in the New Testament that talks to, he's talking about the Roman soldiers and talking about fearing authority, and he says, they who wield the sword do not wield it in vain, be afraid of them. We're God, they are instrument for God's justice. So you're very much in the New Testament, you have the killing of, the woman and the man who was lying to the people of God, where they were trying to deceive him about how much money they made when they sold the house. God kills them both on the spot. So you very much see that judgmental aspect of God in the New Testament, as well as the Old. You also see the grace and compassion and mercy of the Old, as well as in the New. So I don't see the inconsistency in that.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one. How do you reconcile the idea of a loving and caring God with the suffering and loss caused by the COVID-19 pandemic?
What do you mean?
So if there is such a thing as a God that is omnibenevolent, which is to say all-loving and omniscient and, all-knowing and omnipotent, so all-powerful, how do you explain the suffering that was caused by COVID, given the fact that there is a God that's omnibenevolent and omnipotent?
I would say that I would answer this in two ways. I guess in terms of suffering in general, take out COVID outside of it for a second. The answer would simply be of human free will and the fact that we live in a broken world. That the fact that the reason that God doesn't destroy evil right now is because He destroys us in the process, because we're also evil. That He gives us the freedom to act within context, because one day He will make everything right, but two, because He's trying to save as many people as possible. So it's God's mercy of the fact that this is still going on, because we're all deserving of this wrath. The suffering is the reality that when Adam sinned against God, or when Eve originally sinned against God, or when they both sinned against God, we, from that point on, we're living in a broken world. And God makes it very clear in Scripture, don't expect, even living a good life, that you're going to live without suffering, because suffering is inevitable. So the Bible doesn't pretend that there is no suffering. It does say God cares about your suffering. And I remember, on a side note, I won't go into specific details because I want to protect some information, but I ended up getting close to a youth that I ended up getting separated from at one of my old jobs. And I remember when I got separated, there was definitely fault on my end, and it was my actions that caused it, though my heart was always sincere in my approach to it. But let's just say mistakes catch up to you. And I remember feeling very, I was bitter and I was angry and I was sad about it. And I was bitter towards God for about a month. And then one day it was a Saturday night and I'm praying to God and I'm saying, God, please look after him, please save him, please watch over him. The following day I go to church and they're talking about destiny. I'm like, I thought it was my destiny to stay in contact with this youth. I'm not really interested in hearing this message. And I was bitter again. And so I finished, we do the worships and he starts, he says, I just want to go home at this point. He says, I have dates I want to give. I don't know if they mean anything to somebody, but so he gives the first 2 dates. Some people react. Then he gives the third date. He says December 15th. And that was a youth's birthday that I was able to be there by its own miracle of God. And so he gives that date. I remember my first words being, damn it, God. Because I knew God was talking to me, even though I didn't want to hear him. And he says, December 15th, does that mean anything? So I raised my hand and says, yeah, it means something to me. And he asked me what it meant. The guy knew a little bit about this story. I talked to him before, but he definitely didn't know the date. And he begins to tell me exactly what I was praying for the night before, that God was going to watch over him and look after him. And I guess to respond to suffering is that, and that's one thing I learned in my last year's faith, is that God may not prevent suffering, but he does care that we're suffering. And that I think the key as Christians, or what differs Christians from non-Christians when it comes to suffering, is that we have a God to go to. We have a God that cares about us suffering, that we can go to, that we can form a relationship and confide into in those hard moments. And I'm telling you, as somebody who's done both, who's gone through hard times without him and who's gone hard times with him, there's a heck of a difference when you go through hard times with him. So I would say that would be God's response to suffering. In regards to COVID, the only thing I would say on that is that you have to make 2 distinguishing factors here. There is a suffering that was caused by the virus, such as the death and so, and that falls more into what I was saying about suffering happens. There's also a suffering that wasn't caused by God, but was caused by people. You know, the fact that you could see your friends, the fact, you know, especially you've got the grim end of this, the suicides, the lockdowns, the forced mass, the separations, all the sufferings that were brought by these regiments. God, even in the churches. And let me say I don't know if there's any Christian youth that was going through this, was by chance listening to this, who suffered, and the churches went along with this and made you believe that God was for these restrictions. And this is why I'm so adamant in speaking out against them and saying, no, God was never for these restrictions. He does not stand by the suffering that was caused by these restrictions. This was the people of the church and the government that were inflicting the suffering. This was not God. God was condemning what was going on, saying this does not come from my heart. That's why the convoy came to put an end to it, because that was the man of God moving against this.
Right.
But yeah, I'd say to that, I say this was never God's intention for this to take place. This was the human heart that brought these suffering that came to be. And it's funny, you know, going back on a quick side note, every time we question, you know, it goes back to the original line in the garden, you know, did God really say and did God really know? Every time we question, did God really know? Every time we go against the principles of God, such as with COVID, it's funny how suffering always follows suit with that.
Yeah, I think it's useful to imagine a moral ideal. So that's one of the ways in which Jordan Peterson talks about God, for instance. I think it's useful to imagine that and to aim towards it and to encourage other people to aim towards it. And, you know, obviously if that's true, then, you know, then not aspiring to that moral ideal would lead to more suffering. But I guess it's just hard for me to, you know, understand how people take that leap of faith and say, okay, well, that abstract moral ideal that we're aiming towards, like that thing is the creator of the universe.
Because our faith is not in the God itself, our faith is in trusting in that God. Because most of us who have faith in God are convinced of his existence because we've seen through our own experiences him come through in our life. Like that faith is trust, and that trust gets built. I have faith today. You asked me years ago, my family will tell you this, so like, Casey having faith, yeah, right. I remember even mocking the idea when I was younger, going, how can I trust someone like that? Like, that's ridiculous. I had so much issues with trusting people due to my own baggage in life. But my faith with God today is based on, I've been through those situations, I've been through hard moments, I've been through, God knows, so many situations, and I've seen God come through time and time and time again. You know, like where I am right now in my life and the blessings that God has brought, and to see his hand move in these situations, and, you know, to pray to God and to see him come through, like that's where my trust is founded in. That's why I trust him.
Right. How do you engage with doubts or moments of spiritual uncertainty? How do you maintain your faith during challenging times?
That's a good question. One of the things I would say is remind yourself why you have faith to begin with. a lot, it happens more than you would know. Christians coming to desert seasons where they don't feel God is around them, and they go, okay, why? Like, they feel so lost in those moments. And one of the things that I was led to is in spirit was, okay, why do you believe? Why did you trust me? Why do you follow me? What's still keeping you here? And sometimes when you're going through dark valleys, when you're going through times where you feel like God's not around, you remind yourselves, okay, look at how God came to me before. Look at how much He helped me in those circumstances. Why do I believe God is different right now? I actually had a dream where God had spoken to me, and He asked me a question. He said, the times that you look at me and the times that you felt that I let you down or that I didn't come through in the way that you wanted me to, I says, but you've also seen times me answer you, times where I came through for you. Does the times I haven't answered you change the times that I have? In other words, do you base your expectations and your trust in me off the times that I've come through for you, or the times that I haven't? And does the times that I haven't, or you felt that I haven't, change the times that I have? In other words, does God become less real despite Him showing Himself to you because of the times you feel He's not there? Now, obviously, that implies to a Christian that someone who's seen God come through, and obviously, as somebody who's not a Christian, there would be a different view on that. But as a Christian, that would be my response to that question. That would be one of the things I would raise in response to it.
So it seems like you're using any doubt that might creep up as a way to reinforce your faith?
I'm saying that the way you deal with that is reminding yourself why you believe to begin with. It's like when you look at what happened in Egypt when God freed His people. Why did He always tell His people, remember what I did in Egypt? Because when they would forget, and then they'd go through moments of doubt and they start worshipping all the other idols, the reason they did, or ultimately what brought them to that point, was they forgot who God was. Why would you worship an idol when you know the real thing just saved you? Like, let's assume it to be true for a second. Again, because you can question whether it's true or not, but let's assume for the sake of conversation, let's assume it's true. Let's say you witness God bring down plagues on one of the biggest empires on the face of the earth at the time, to a point that convinced a monster of a pharaoh, or a monster of a leader, to fearfully release the people that he was enslaving. And then he pursued you across a river. The river's open up in front of you, you cross it, and then they close on the ones following them and completely kill them. And let's say this days after this has happened, a guy goes up on a hill saying, I'm going to go speak to that very same God that did all of that. A few days go by and they lose hope. They're like, where's this guy? We think he died. And they start worshipping statues. Now, if you had just witnessed all of that, you'd be looking at these people going, what on earth, God's name, green earth, are you doing? You just witnessed a God come through. You just witnessed Him doing all these things for you. Right. And now you're worshipping statues because it's been 5 days where He hasn't spoken to you.
Yeah, doesn't seem very rational, does it?
No. So that would be my response to now. Obviously, you as a Christian, you would have to go through those events, and obviously you would have to believe that God brought you through these things, or in this case, God actually brought you through these things. In my own life, I'll say God has definitely brought me through these things. But that would be my answer to that question.
Right, so I guess, like, if you're looking at Old Testament stories, like the one you just mentioned in Exodus, I think, I guess the question would be, how come, like, why would you believe that those stories, and, you know, I'm not going to pretend, like, I know, like, people fall on different sides of this issue, and that's fine, but, like, why would you assume that those stories are historically accurate?
Because I witnessed stories in my own life that show me that the same God that acted in those moments is able to act in my life right now. That's ultimately what, it's like what Paul says in the, I believe he says this in one of the letters. Sorry. Let not your faith be based on persuasive argument, but let it be based on the power of God. In my own case, the reason I believe in God, I think, is the fundamental, and I believe what should be the fundamental cornerstone of someone's faith as a Christian is the power, seeing the hand of God intervene in your life. And it's when you witness those things, when you witness God comes through, that's what your faith is based off of.
Okay. I mean, I know you want to be mindful of, you know, not sharing anything too personal, but would you be able to share an experience that convinces you of God's existence?
Sure. I mean, I can give a lot of examples to this, so feel free to move on if you want to, but Although one of them is a friend. You've actually met him. I guess I'm okay to say the first name on the you've met Nolan on my birthday.
Yeah.
So this is actually just to give you a context. I'll tell you the same story because this happened with him. We were talking over Xbox one day, and he tells me that his arm started really hurting. I think it was his arm, and just all of a sudden didn't really know why the pain was there. Wasn't sure. And he starts telling me about this over Xbox, and so we're about to game, and I said, "Can I pray for you after?" He says, "Okay." So we game, and then at the end of it, he before he goes off, I'm like, "Do you still want me to pray for you?" He says, "All right." And then for whatever reason, I feel like telling him, like, "Do you know why we pray? Not so much why we pray for healing, but like, do you know why faith is vital to healing?" He says, "No." I said, "Because God will not share His glory. When God reaches out, when God answers someone, He does not want that glory to go to someone else. So He'll ask you, do you trust Him? Are you looking up to me? Is it me that you're dependent on?" And it's in those moments where you really see the hand of God. And so I just asked those questions and says, "Okay, finally I pray for him." And honestly, I wasn't expecting anything to happen in that moment. I really wasn't. Which is funny to say you need faith for healing, but I can tell you that my faith wasn't as confident as maybe it appeared for him at the time. But all that to say is, after I finished praying for him, and I wouldn't have believed it otherwise, I hear him freak out on my mic. He's like, "No way, no way." And he starts doing push-ups. Like, "I couldn't do this before." He's like, "It still hurts a bit, but the pain dramatically left." And he's freaking out over the mic, and I know Noah, like, there's no way this guy would do that if there's no way he'd face something like that. Now, people can speculate on God's green if they want, but I know that kid, and I know that's, I know he's legitimate. And I remember at the end of that call, I was tearing off. I'm like, no way did I just see that. I experienced a healing myself with his thigh. I'd done about a month with this, fighting with his thigh, putting cream on it, it wasn't working. And then the day, this was a Saturday, I was going to go to the clinic Monday. And we come to Sunday, and I'm having it hard to go for prayer on it. And I'm like, "Mom, should I go for prayer?" I feel like I had it hard. She's like, "Yeah, go for it." So I go in front, and the guy prays for me. And I actually asked him afterwards, I know he has no medical experience. Because he prays for me, he says, "I'm telling you the infection is dead, but the pimple is still there, that's going to go away in time." No medical background. Says, "Okay." That very night, the pimple reacts and pus starts coming out of it. So that wouldn't have happened if the infection was already dead at the time. The following day, I go to the clinic, word for word, the guy tells me the exact same thing. I could talk about words of knowledge. I think that'll be we can move on after one, but there's I've got a few examples. I'm trying to target a specific one. Well, I'll take the example that I shared earlier with the youth. God telling me exactly the thing the day after. There was another one, I think I told you the story before about my goodness, there's so many you forget a lot of them. I've forgotten a lot of them.
It's alright, yeah.
Yeah, there was the one, it was about being proud of me. Where I was going to a previous church, and a pastor had spoken over me at one point when I was going through hard times. He said, "I feel God saying He's proud of you," and it really meant a lot to me. And then I left that church, and I lost trust in that pastor, and I'm going to this new church, and I'm like, "God, was that you, or was that him?" Because that meant a lot to me. And all of a sudden, I feel at the end of the message, so I'm praying this on a Saturday night, and I feel God's Spirit telling me, "It was me, I am proud of you." The day after Sunday, I go for prayer. I don't specify anything. And the guy prayed for me. He's never said this or anything like this up until that point. Oh, even after. And he said, "I don't know why God's telling me to say this, but God telling me to say this, that He's proud of you." The day after, I'm praying this about God. So there's an example, and there's definitely some of them are more recent, so I don't want to comment.
It's alright.
I'd rather not.
But
those are a few examples off the top of my head.
Good. Yeah. So I'm hearing those stories, and I mean a lot of other explanations kind of come rushing in. But for instance, your last one that you just said, it seems to me that you said it was your pastor at your church.
Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that somebody in that position of leadership might have exceptional skills related to emotional intelligence and being able to read people and kind of pick up on subtle clues and knowing what someone's going through and knowing what they might want to hear on a level that might not be conscious.
So how would somebody accurately read that something such a what would they see that would make them think, okay, he needs to be told he's proud of him?
Right. So I'm not claiming that on a conscious
level.
No.
But you're speculating that potential.
Right.
So my question would be, what going into specifics of that? What would be, we talked about somebody being able to read a situation like that, or potentially read a situation like that.
Mm-hmm.
How would somebody read a situation like that? Like I got a background in psychology. I can tell you somebody needed to be told they're proud of them or not without knowing relatively that person. And I can tell that's the only time he's ever told me that, and I never hear him say anything about it. It's not something you hear commonly in the Christian world. It's not one of those repeat lines, I'm proud of you. You don't hear it often.
Mm-hmm. So I think that some people are better than others at reading people.
Mm-hmm. But what is it specifically that he read into that would tell him that? Because when you say read people, like I said, I got a background in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go off something to read people, and there's certain tells that will tell you certain things, and even that, like, they have to be specific. So what specifically would he have been able to see to know that he needed to say that?
I mean, you're good at reading people, yes. Right? Like, I feel like when we're playing, what is it? Exploding Kittens or whatever, like, yeah. and you're trying to pick a good card, yeah. And you're like reading my facial micro expressions.
I work in group homes. I'm good at reading people.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. Like, I think that people in leadership, in particular, happen to be better than the average person at reading people.
But let's go in the psychology of that. How was I able to at least have an idea of what card was the right one? What reaction did I read? Well, put it this way: I knew if you saw your cards, you knew what card I was touching. And I knew that your facial expression of either frustration or shock or worry would come about if you were afraid of losing that card. Right. So I was relying and hopefully reading that cue with some degree of accuracy. That I was putting my hand on the card and I was hoping your facial expression of crap, he's got the card, to give away so that I would know which one. That's how I was reading that. Right. But that doesn't tell me whether somebody needs to feel they're proud of them or what the emotional, that doesn't tell me anything of that. It just, I'm reading an immediate facial reaction of either frustration or shock or in this case would be specifically worry. Right. And that's specifically when I'm reading to make that reaction. But anytime you're reading in psychology or anything you're trying to read on a person, like, you can't make an accurate read off no information. You need a decent amount of information for specific reads. And depending on how complex those reads are, you need a decent amount of information. I'm saying exactly how would you make that argument in the case that I'm presenting? Or in the testimony that I'm reading? How exactly would the guy know? What telltale would he have seen to know that that's what I needed to be told in that moment?
Right, so good question. I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. I feel like our listeners should know Casey was, I think he's being modest. I think that Casey was... I think like it was getting so frustrating that he would always pick my good cards that I had to put him down on the table facing down. Yeah, I think everyone started doing that because it's like, all right, well, Casey knows how to read us, It's like, I don't know how he does it, but he's always getting my defuse, And so I think at that point, if you're looking at somebody like me that maybe isn't so good at reading facial micro expressions, I think that at that point, if you're comparing you, who's, semi-decent at reading facial micro expressions, and somebody in a position of leadership, especially in a church, I think that at that point you're just talking about gradations of being good at reading subtle cues. And to answer your question, I don't know that I can point to anything specific to say, okay, well, he picked up on your, eyebrow raising or whatever. But I think that again, I'm not even claiming that he picked it up consciously. I'm not even saying that he looked at you and said, okay, well, this guy needs to hear these words in this order.
So how did he know?
Well, but that's the thing. Maybe he didn't know consciously. He just kind of picked it up.
Or maybe it was God speaking to him and that's what he repeated it and that was exactly what I was praying for the day before. How do you know that wasn't the case?
I'm not saying it wasn't the case. I'm just saying it could be explained in naturalistic terms like intuition.
Mm-hmm. But I'm just saying when it comes to reading people, unless you take a shot in the dark and you get really lucky with that, like as a guy who's, like you said, who's decent at reading people, who's got experience with reading people, it's one thing to read someone's expression and to pick up someone's worry on touching a specific card and reading that and taking an educated guess that might be a valuable card to them. It's a whole other to be able to specifically say, okay, that guy needs to be told that he's proud of him because that's what he was praying for the night before and that's what it meant a lot to him without knowing that individual in specific. They're not the same thing. You in order to be able to accurately read that using telltales, you need to read into a lot of telltales to be able to have some relative idea to be able to accurately predict that.
So if the claim was that the pastor was able to detect those telltale signs consciously, I would agree with you. but I'm not making that claim. I'm making the claim that on some level you were able to detect my facial microexpressions consciously, and on another level, the leader, the pastor of the church was able to unconsciously. I think that's more credible than the alternative.
But even unconscious reading rely on that. It's subconscious, so it goes back to the part of your brain that's not actively analyzing it, and it's what you call instinct at that point. Right. But if it's natural instinct, if you're talking solely about what your body subconsciously analyzes and reacts on, your body is only reading into so much to make a decision like that. Mm-hmm. There's only so much you can rationally know. So how do you explain the things that you can't rationally know, or the things that go way beyond the things you rationally know? And again, in my case, I can name you several examples of this. This is one example. I could bring back the example I said before. And when it starts piling on like that, when you start being told things that people have no natural way of knowing, and it starts like another example off the bat of my head when I was younger. I remember I was just starting to be a Christian at that point. I think I was like 15, and I remember getting to an argument with my mom. Do you remember that when I shut down a teacher's computer? You weren't in that class, but you might have heard about that.
It rings a bell, yeah.
Yeah, you know the teacher. I don't know if I should mention the teacher, but you know the teacher I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll give a quick summary to what happened. I was in computer class, and I found out while playing around in the computer, trying to make a program that if you clicked a button, it would shut off your computer, because that was fun like that. I realized that I accidentally stumbled upon that a remote shutdown feature in the Windows computers we were using, that you can remotely shut down other people's computer using their IP.
Casey's a hacker. We're just going to put it out there.
I'm definitely not a hacker, but it was a cool exploit I found, and obviously being a kid, I didn't keep it to myself and started using it on other people. Anyway, long story short, we're in computer class. This was a while after I learned it. And I think it was Wensky that found a bypass to the, because the computers we were using in other classes, you could access the C, is it the CM? I forget the black screen, I forget the name of it, there's a C something, that lets you enter these commands.
And the command line?
Yes, command line. See, I'm not a hacker.
He's only pretending.
Yeah, very basic stuff. Just an exploit I found. So you couldn't turn it on because it didn't allow you to have access to it. But once we found out there was a glitch by rebooting the computer or restarting the computer, you can actually access it. And so I started sending shutdown commands to my friends by getting the IP. But me being smart as I am, forgot my friend's IP. I didn't try to screw it once again. I forgot his IP. And
that's good.
I started guessing them within the 10 digits. I think I had it down to the last 10 digits. So I started guessing them. And I didn't do an immediate shutdown. I did a 45-second timer with a message going ha because I was expecting him to stop. I didn't really want to shut down his computer. I just wanted to control. And out of all the people I guessed, I ended up guessing my teachers. So he's got a 45-second timer with my username showing that his computer gets shut down. He obviously doesn't know how to stop it, and his computer shuts down, and he didn't save his work that he did all period. He was pissed off. Very pissed off.
Casey was suspended for 2 years. And,
no.
We never saw him
I
again.
got very lucky. Bless him above. This is another miracle in its own that he protected me. Anyhow, the point of the story I was going with is that after all that happened, my parents came into my defense because the teacher really blew that gasket. But it kind of got found out that I wasn't doing any work that I was supposed to, and I was just fooling around. And I think it was something else that I wasn't doing my homework for a while, and they were really pissed off. And at one point, my mom for the next couple of days just stopped talking to me and stopped interacting with me. And I'm like, my goodness, does this ever end? And I remember I was in the bed at the time. My bedroom was being rented out to somebody, or I think it was my grandmother. And I was in the basement, and I'm praying to God. This was the night before the day it happened. And I'm praying to God. I'm like, funny God, he says, you say you forgive, but the people, in my case, I was always referencing my mom, says they're not all that forgiving. This they won't let it go. What do I do? The following day, I'm doing a vacuum, and I remember specifically my mom interrupted me to talk to me, and she said, I was angry at you for the last couple of days. It says, I'm going to stop being angry at you, and we can move on. It says, your punishment is that you don't get to go to the movies that we're going, but after that, it's over. This was after I prayed about it the night before. So this is another example, just to give, go back to, okay, what if this is an accident? What if this is coincidence? What if this is subconscious? How many times do these subconscious moments where something is said so well timed to what I'm praying for the day before, but before you begin to question, okay, maybe it's not an accident. Maybe there is a God out there. And I was speaking about this as other examples I got about my head of incidents
right.
Like that.
Yeah. So going back to your pastor, I mean, I think there's a pretty plausible naturalistic explanation to what happened.
I mean, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I just gave it, right? The intuition argument.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a very... I think it's a far-fetched example, and I don't think it's one that's based on reality. And not one that's been elaborated all that much. But, I mean, we can move on, but if you want to elaborate a little more on it, I'd love to hear it. Because I don't really see a coherent explanation to how that took place.
So what's incoherent about a church leader having a high degree of emotional intelligence?
The fact that anybody in the psychological field will tell you that there's no way this guy knew nearly enough to be able to make that accurate prediction based
consciously.
On that. Yeah, or unconsciously. What data is he basing himself off? In order to give away tells, it needs to be based on something, and he had nothing to go off. How on earth would he have come to that conclusion? I think the analysis, in all respect, is a little far-fetched.
Right. You might have heard of Clever Hans, the horse. So the horse was basically, it was claimed that the horse could count, and so it was a big fuss. How the hell can a horse count? And so the horse was in front of scientists, and there was a crowd, and the scientists held up a sign or whatever, and it was like 7 + 4, and then the horse started tapping, and then when it got to 11 times, the crowd erupts in cheers, and it was later found out that the horse was, and he get a carrot or whatever, and then it was later found out that the horse was picking up on the subtle clues of the crowd, and okay, I'm almost there, and then he stops at 11. So if a horse can do it, if a horse can pick up unconsciously on telltale signs and what people expect from him, I think a church leader can definitely do it.
But I think what you're mixing up is telltale signs versus what they actually tell you. Telltale signs can tell you something. They'll tell you some general emotion, but they're not going to tell you everything.
And I'm not making that claim.
But in order for him to specifically have said, I'm proud of you, that is something specific. That's not just, okay, I feel that you're generally worried or generally depressed or generally... That's something specific. That's something... Especially the day after that you're pregnant about it. I don't know. Like, we can agree to disagree. I think the conclusion you're drawing or the analysis you're drawing is far-fetched.
Okay. I mean, that's fine. Going back to the first example that you gave about Nolan being able to do push-ups after you prayed for him. I mean, you've probably heard of the placebo effect, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, would you be willing to accept that was a possible naturalistic explanation to what happened?
I mean, you can have a conversation with him and ask him if he thought he was going through the placebo effect.
Yeah, well, people that go through the placebo effect don't usually think that they do, right?
Yeah, but I can tell you enough about the placebo effect to really point out where it's inconsistent with it. You really have to go back and analyze exactly what the placebo effect does. But I guess here's a question. Placebo effect implies that you would expect to receive something. Did he expect to be healed?
I mean, if you told him that you were going to pray for him, sure.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's one explanation. Well, I mean, alright, take the example of my sty. Placebo effect?
Of your what now?
The sty that was healed. Placebo effect?
I mean, I think that it's easy to draw naturalistic explanation, from the stories that you gave, and it could be placebo effect, it could be something else.
So what would be the natural explanation for the sty?
Well, I'm not a doctor, but I just gave you two naturalistic explanations to.
But what would be the natural explanation for that specific example?
I mean, when you say sty, that's like a pimple?
Yes.
Pimples go away for a number of reasons, right?
Okay, but here you are going for prayer, tells you that it's dead and that the pimple will go away, that the infection is dead. It reacts that night, so the infection was obviously still there, because it wouldn't have reacted if it wasn't. And the following day, the doctor tells you the exact same thing. How do you explain that naturally?
Right, so the claim made by people, and I don't think the fact, I don't think placebo experiments, I don't think they're really disputed in the medical community, but the conclusion that people tend to draw from placebo effects controlled trials is that the body can heal itself. The body has the power to heal itself if it believes that it's receiving treatment for the illness.
Within reason, right? You can't make someone walk based off placebo. There's still a reality that follows that.
Well, sure, you have to, respect the laws of physics and whatnot, but I mean, surely a sty isn't outside the realm of possibility for.
And like I said, sorry?
Like a pimple healing overnight isn't unheard of, right?
No, but it's sure as heck very coincidental the fact that I'm getting told by someone at a church that the infection's already dead. The infection is reacting that very night, and then I'm being told the exact same thing by the doctor the following day by somebody with no medical experience. You gotta admit that's a heck of a coincidental terms of outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when those outcomes are being stacked over and over, like you're asking where that faith comes into conclusion. I mean, look, no, people don't have to believe either I'm telling the truth or that ultimately this was God. I've always said at the beginning, these are my experience. Some of my experience. I could tell you a lot more. These are some of my experience, but ultimately, you want to know if there's a God or not. Put him to the test yourself and see. Ask him if he's really real, and see if he won't show himself to you the same way he did to me.
Right.
In my examples, a lot of them aren't the most spectacular, or at least some are a lot more subtle. There's definitely people who have you have people with cancers who disappeared, tumors that weren't there anymore after prayer, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
I've witnessed people paralyzed and no longer be paralyzed, dead people come back to life. Like you look at the miracles of the claims of the scriptures, when you have dead people coming back to life, a dead man who was dead for 3 days coming back to life.
Right, so then I guess at that point you'd have to question the historical authenticity of the biblical stories, right? Whether or not those stories really happened, right?
Yeah.
But just going back to a point that you said, I mean, I think there's a difference between experiencing a number of coincidences and things that can't readily be explained in a naturalistic framework and having that seeming experience.
But it goes back to my analogy of poker. You're playing poker against somebody, and that guy pulls double aces 5 times in a row. How many times does he pose amazing cards and wins a hand before you begin to question whether he's cheating or not because somebody else is giving him cards? How lucky or how much natural luck can play a factor in before you begin to question if there's an external force playing in the hand? And I think these stories come down to that is 1, 2, 5 times, okay, crazy coincidence, these explanations. But when they've happened, man, I've lost count the amount of times they've happened, to be entirely honest. And I've had recent ones too that, like I said, I won't go in specifically because they could still affect some people, and there's some details I don't want to give online. And there's, frankly, to be honest, plenty that I've forgotten. But how many times does it happen that you have to witness it before you begin to wonder, is there something out there?
Okay, so there is such a thing as survivorship bias, right? And so I think that was first coined in the 20th century. And, I think originally they were looking at all the planes that were coming back fighting from the war, like World War II or whatever. And they noticed that all the planes that came back had bullet holes, I don't know, around the east side of the wing or whatever. And they're like, well, this is where all of our planes are being shot at. And so this is where we have to add some armor because all our planes are getting shot there. But what those people didn't realize is that there's a difference between all the planes getting shot on the top part of the left wing and all the planes coming back having bullet holes in the top part of the left wing.
It's basically saying that the top... They're not factoring in the planes that did survive.
That's right.
They're only factoring the planes that survived, and they're basing their data off that.
Right. So if your pimple hadn't gone away that day, that story would be out of your mind. You would forget about it in a week, and it wouldn't count on the long list of coincidences that you've experienced that says, well, of course, this has to go back to God.
But it goes back to what I said originally. Does God's existence base the fact on the times he does announce it, or does it base the fact on he does? Does God not answering change the fact that he did? Because at the end of the day, what proves the manifestation of God is, can the supernatural take place? Can things that with no natural explanation, or even with natural interference, such as things that happen in such a specific time for where you begin to wonder, okay, how on earth did that happen just by coincidence? Because at some points, even coincident, what we call coincidences, when they happen in such specific, and especially when it's happened frequently, you begin to question, okay, it's like somebody following you. Oh, I ran into him at the store. Oh, I also ran into a gas station. Oh, he's right now, he's biking by my house. How many times does that happen before you're wondering, before you're getting stuck?
Right. I mean,
how many times? And I'm sure the guy would tell you the same. Oh, I'm just biking around. Oh, I'm just at the. Oh, what are the odds of that? But how many times do you have to see that same guy around you before you question, like, okay, is he stalking me by chance?
Right. I mean, I think at that point you definitely want to.
Yeah, but what?
Be
Okay,
careful.
But it can be a coincidence, right? It can be that he's just in the right place at the right time. It can be that he's just shopping. He needs to go shop there. So what tells you that he's stalking you?
Okay, here I think there might be a little bit of confusion So you talk about a guy that's stalking you, that's following you in like 3, 5, 10 different places.
I'm simply pointing out the fact that what we blow off as coincidences, when they happen over and over again, at some point the natural mind questions logically, okay, are these really coincidences if they happen in such a well-timed event over and over again? And I'm using the examples of stalker to pinpoint that there's only so many times you're going to run into somebody by accident in a short period of time before you begin to question whether it's intentional or not. In the same way, there's only so many amount of times that you get words of knowledge that very well-timed answers to your prayers happen in your relationship with God as a person before you begin to question, okay, is there really a God out there? That's the analogy that I'm making. And again, it's not something that would absolutely convince a random individual being told this. I mean, ultimately, you can come to whatever conclusions you want, but it's at least in part the reason why I believe what I believe.
Right. I mean, again, I guess, I mean, would you agree that if that pimple hadn't healed the day of or whatever, that you wouldn't count that story as evidence for God?
Absolutely, because there would have been no intervention. I think that's a very logical assumption, no? But then does that change just because God chose not to answer that specific case? If there's other cases where he did answer, other healings that he took place, would that change the fact that he's real or not? Because he didn't answer a specific prayer?
Right, okay, so I just want to kind of break this down a little bit. So you have all the stories that have happened to you from as far back as you can remember. And the event or story was either coincidental, and therefore you consider it evidence to be God, or it wasn't coincidental, therefore you don't consider it evidence to be God, and you just kind of put it in another bin.
No, I'm saying that when you have several instances, particularly when you're being told things that you know that an individual has no way of knowing, that are extremely well-timed and specific to allow a certain course of action to take place, you over the span of your life, over years, and they consistently happen, after you pray about them, you question whether or not it's God answering you or not. There's that logical draw that goes, okay, is there a hand of God behind this?
But the truth is, everybody experiences coincidences to some degree, right?
You're telling me everyone prays and everyone has these answers and everyone draws them as just coincidences and some general spiritual force?
I'm saying everybody has experiences that are meaningful to them, and everybody experiences, what Carl Jung called synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences, even people that don't believe in God. And so I'm just not sure how you can count it as evidence for God's existence if even atheists have experiences like that.
I guess it's different when you witness it yourself and not just being told about it by someone else. I guess that's one of the elements to it, is that it's fine to say looking at it from an outside source. And again, these are personal revelations, right? These are stories that you can tell that definitely draw people's interest. But these are, at the end of the day, no one really believes it until they live it themselves. But it's like, you can look at that from the outside going, okay, there's an explanation, there's an explanation. You don't think I've asked these same questions myself? You don't think that throughout my life, and again, there's a lot of stories that I haven't done, that I even go more, but I know we have other questions we want to get to. But at some point, like, even me, I don't know what you call them, one of the greatest skeptics on our, well, jokingly, the greatest skeptic on our, or one of the biggest skeptics on our, I question God about everything. I question God about his integrity. I question God about his existence. I question God about everything. And my family can testify to this. My family would say I never thought this kid would be Christian today, of how many questions this guy was asking, and how much, like, this whole idea of faith, believe blindly in the given God, non-existent with me. I wasn't that type of an individual. I wasn't going to buy into that. For me to be as convinced as I am today, I think that's its own miracle that there's a God moving in. And that's, I could talk about the time events. I can also talk about the spiritual transformation, the emotional transformation God in my life. I went from a shy kid, to an emotional mess, to a kid with self-esteem that God brought a lot of healing. I could talk about where I am today, God bringing in bringing joy to my heart, dreams, being able to close, I was talking about the youth that I've had, the ability, the impact, those relationships, things that I can only have dreamed looking back, that God has brought in reality, I was in a situation, I won't go into specifics, but I had my trust attacked, unrightfully so, and I should have been damaged given the situation, but it wasn't. And actually, the very thing that was used to damage my reputation was actually used to build it unintentionally.
Right.
That I associate 100% to God. I've seen people come after me, and something happened to them very shortly after that took place, and God confirming, okay, yeah, that was me. Now, obviously, that's very vague, and for reasons that I won't go into detail, it's hard to justify.
Sure.
But to give it a little bit of feedback where I'm coming from, this is why I believe what I believe. But anyway, did you want to go further on the questions? Or did you want to dig more a little bit?
I mean, surely you would agree that there's people... Last one, and then I'm going to turn the page. Would you agree that there's people from other faiths that have similar experiences to yours that they believe to be confirming of their God's existence?
They can believe what they want. Do I believe the same thing happened to them? No, I don't. And if for those that claim they do, I would love to be across the table to talk to them and ask them questions about where, when, and what happened to determine or not whether their statements are consistent with what they're saying. In other words, like going to court of law, somebody can claim you're a murderer, but there's a reason why we cross-examine. There's a reason why we ask relevant questions about it.
Sure.
You want to cross-examine my accounts, I'll be more than happy to be consistent, and you can test them yourselves. But I would also put the same regimen on somebody else. And from my own experience, I've talked with several people of faith. I have not seen that same conviction. I have not seen that same. Usually, most people who believe what they believe in their other faiths is because they were told that as a kid, and they've held on to it, and it's no longer rational, but there's an emotional attachment to it. From my experience, that's been the case. Or they hold themselves to an intellectualism where they either distort the facts to justify it rationally, or that they've convinced themselves rationally that that's the conclusion that they've drawn. But I've yet to, the experiences I'm talking about, from the conversations I've had, no, I don't see the same pattern, at least not from my own experience. And if there's people who've claimed that, I would love to be on the other side of a table having a conversation with them.
Right. But the fact there's 2 billion Muslims, for example, on the planet, 25% of the global population, are you saying that nobody in that 2 billion population has had a meaningful experience that's confirming of their God's existence?
Yes, because if there is a God, there's only one God. And if there's only one form of God, and if there's only one form of God, then he's the only one that can interfere in nature. Which means that either God is either misintentioning everyone, which is, I guess, a possibility of that, or that, put it this way, if you believe a tree is God, and I believe a rock is God, either one of them is God, neither of them is God, and if one of them is a God, that rock can do more than just being a rock. And I guess it goes more than that logic. You know, if the God of Islam is true, then he can intervene in reality. If my God is true, he can intervene in reality. But if God is Islam is true, I know for a fact my God is not true because the God of Islam says my God is not true. And I know that if my God is true, that Islam is not true because I know that my God is true.
Right.
So if I see God manifesting and showing himself to be real in my life, then I can logically conclude that it's not the case for anyone else. And that's why that comes to my certainty that I know ultimately what they're claiming as a bluff. Now, I would gladly question them. I would gladly analyze what they say, and I would gladly put that to the test.
Sure.
But that's where my conviction comes in that respect.
Do you think it's possible for Muslims or Hindus or whatever to have experiences that, even though it's not actually God talking to them, that they believe that it's God talking to them?
I mean, you can come to a lot of different conclusions for a lot of different reasons. At the end of the day, like I said, truth is truth regardless of whether you believe it to be true or not.
Right. So I guess the question would be, if people have experiences that they interpret to be God speaking to them, how do you differentiate between the wheat and the chaff, right?
I say one of the things that I looked at individually is, can other people verify it, and is an objectivity to it? What I mean by that is this. The first question, because I come from, let's just say I know about, what's the word for it? When it comes to delusions, when it comes to manic episodes and stuff like that. I've not experienced them, but I know people who are close to me who have. So I definitely know that minds can play tricks on you and stuff like that. I'm very aware of that. And the first question I asked myself in that situation was, okay, what if that's going on the case? It's a question I asked myself. It's a logical question to ask. It's like, how do I know my experiences of what I'm seeing is reality? The first thing is they affect other people. Other people will be able to correlate it. And the second thing is that there's an objective imprint on reality because of it. It's not just a matter of you hear things and believe it's him. You actually see them happen in front of you, and you actually see other people notice it, going, okay, yeah, there's something else there too.
Yeah, I would love to push back a little bit more. Like, I don't know how someone can draw objective knowledge from subjective experiences.
And fine, it's subjective again, but how will you know what is objective and subjective based on my testimony alone?
Well, if you're talking about experiences that you've had, meaningful experiences, synchronicity, whatever, I mean, how are they anything other than subjective?
I'll give a concrete example of something that happened to someone. I'll give three examples that happened to my immediate family. My mom was driving a car, and she loses control of the vehicle. She screams in the name of Jesus. The car stops. She had hit a road of black ice. The way she describes it physics couldn't account for how the car stopped. Okay, you might disqualify it and analyze it and so that, but there's one example. 2 examples from my grandmother. One of them was that she was about to be taken advantage of by a guy she had over. And the guy was a black belt karate, I believe, or taekwondo, something to that effect. He was the guy can hold his own for sure. This is the account from what I've heard, alright, so I don't have all the specific details to it. But what I was told was that, and this is having my grandmother, was this guy goes to touch her and she screams the name of Jesus, and all of a sudden he's on all fours in the back. His backhands are touching the floor. And then another example was my grandmother. She went to I think it was like a medium. No, she had a medium friend. I don't know if she knew that at the time or not.
Okay.
But she was talking to both her friends, and the medium was able to get them into this like spell-like state where they started falling asleep.
Hypnosis.
Yes. And as they're about to hit the ground, my grandmother, without realizing, grabs her hand and bangs the table and says in the name of Jesus, and they both wake up. And the medium told them, "Wow, I didn't know your God was that powerful." Again, a couple stories. At some point but like I said, the real way to know whether these stories are true, because you can question, when coming from someone else, you can question them all day long. And at the end of the day, the burden of proof, or what convinces somebody, ultimately lies on them, right? I can have something either staying plain in front of me, or I can be skepticism into something rational. But what ultimately convinces a human being is witnessing these things with their own eyes. If I tell you someone's a murderer because I witnessed them, you can choose to believe what I say or not. But if you witness them murder yourself, that's what's ultimately going to convince you or not. My challenge to anybody who cares to challenge it would be, don't just take what I say for it, challenge God yourself on that matter. If there is a God, if there is one true God, he can alter reality at his will. So why not go him straight to the source and say, God, if you're real, I want to know you. And my question to be, if somebody is that is, well, here's the question I would ask you. If I was right, if the Christian God was true, would you be a Christian?
I mean, yeah, if I was presented sufficiently compelling evidence, then yeah.
Let's say you knew the Christian God. Would you follow him? Would you say, okay, you're my God, I want to serve you, I want to do what you're telling me to do, regardless of what he asks you to do?
I mean, I would be slow to say that I know the existence of any supernatural being.
No, but let's say, for example, I could show you beyond a shadow. Let's say I could show you dead people coming back to life. Let's say the issue of evidence is not an issue. Let's say you are absolutely, wholeheartedly convinced, based on reality, whatever boundaries of evidence that you've put, you're now convinced, okay, there really is a God. Let's assume that he is reality for a second. What would you do with that information? Would you then follow the claims of the scripture where the Bible says, okay, do you now surrender your life to Christ and now do you follow him? If you knew he was real, would you do that?
I mean, I would try to figure out how he wants me to live, yeah, and I try to abide by that for sure.
But if he started telling you things like that you didn't want to listen, let's say, hey, I don't want you, for example, sleeping with a girl that you're not married to, or let's say I don't think this lifestyle is appropriate, I want you to change this, or let's say I want you to leave the person you're with and go with someone else because I don't believe that's the person for you. Would you be obedient to that if he was real?
I mean, sure, but again, I just don't see the evidence for that.
The point I'm making is that, and this was true in my life, and I'm willing to bet it's true for a lot of other people, people look at God and put such a high level of expectations of evidence because ultimately, and sometimes, no, I would say this, that some people God doesn't show himself to because he knows that even if he did, they wouldn't follow him. That the pushback against God is a lot less rational than we think, it's a lot more emotional. That's why the Bible says, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. It's funny how it phrases it, in his heart. Like it's a matter of the heart and not necessarily of the mind. That there is a mental aspect to it, but it's a lot less significant than we want to put emphasis on it. Because I'm willing to bet, let's say among liberals, a lot of them, if you told them with absolute certainty, a lot of them, if they saw a miracle and they knew that God was real, they wouldn't follow. They'd say, I hate you, I want nothing to do with you. And somehow I'd say it.
Yeah, it's plausible.
Anyway, you want to go to... you can come back to this at the end if you want. But
I think it's... There's just so many interesting topics that come up. It's I'm tempted to go through all of them, but I think I'll have to exercise some self-control.
There's always part 2 on this.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. What people say about this episode, but I wouldn't be opposed to talking to you again for sure, publicly.
Well, let me know what your full followers think, and
yeah, well, Yeah, I have no response to that. I can't argue against the truth. Okay, well, I hate to break it to you, but I have it on good authority that it's possible to derive values from facts. And so I'm sorry, Casey. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm so sorry. I know you have your beliefs, but it's not working.
So was there a question with you?
No, I mean, I thought I would just break it to you that, you can derive values from facts, and then I thought we could just move on from that.
I don't think that's a very good interview question. I don't know, that's just me. But it seems like, don't want to open yourself up to getting each other. You want to phrase that in a question by chance? Generally, I know you're a little new to the show, but generally when you have somebody in an interview, you generally want to ask them questions and they give answers. Generally, that's the format how it goes,
I'm still learning the ropes, and I appreciate the patience. But okay, let me phrase it as a question so that he can actually provide an answer. What's wrong with the idea that morality has to relate to the well-being of conscious creatures?
How do you know it has to relate to the well-being of conscious creatures? I think the question phrased as what's wrong with it isn't so much fairly stated as how do you factually know that to be the case?
Well, there's nothing else that it could be intelligibly. If we're going to talk intelligibly about morality and ethics, I don't know what the hell you're talking about if you're not talking about the well-being of conscious creatures.
So what if the intelligibly of ethics is that the intelligibility says nothing about ethics, and that ethics really don't? If you're taking a naturalistic worldview, which let's, for the sake of conversation, assume that's what we're assuming.
Sure.
For the sake of this conversation, what exactly in the naturalistic worldview tells you that there's that ethics are at all relevant, if not exist at all?
Well, it's the only thing that's universal.
What evidence is it that it's universal if that even exists?
Because there's only conscious creatures in the universe that can experience well-being and suffering.
True, but why? I guess what exactly in the objective reality tells you that suffering should be avoided when it's not when it's not implied and when it's not invoked on you? Why should I care about the suffering of someone else, basically?
But there's nothing else that morality could signify other than maximizing well-being.
Except morality just didn't exist to begin with. That it was a purely human construct that we made to control other people. But the question lies is why does morality exist? What tells us morality exists to begin with?
Because there is such a thing as conscious creatures.
Okay, but consciousness doesn't tell you what it is right or wrong. What about consciousness tells you it is right and wrong?
The fact that we can suffer, the fact that I can bring you to my hot stove and you're going to recoil after you're putting your hand on it, right?
That's basic biology. What does that tell you about ethics?
The fact that you want to minimize suffering in yourself.
True, but why would I want to minimize suffering in someone else if it comes to my benefit? What objective moral law or outside law tells me that I should avoid suffering for other people if it comes to my benefit?
Right, so I'm not talking about outside laws. I'm just talking about the conscious creatures that exist.
So how do you objectify it then if you're not talking about outside laws? In other words, I guess the core question is why is it relevant? Why is how I treat other people relevant? Like what exactly makes that relevant?
But there's no way to build a universal system of ethics that doesn't relate to everybody's well-being.
Okay, but when you talk about build, that means they don't exist to begin with. That means you're the one constructing them. If you're the one constructing them, that means they only exist because you decided to construct them, which means that they were never there to begin with.
That's not true.
Well, it's implied, isn't it? When you build something, it's implied that if you weren't in the process of building it, that it wouldn't exist.
Right, but
if I built a house, if I didn't build it, if I wasn't the one building it, the house wouldn't be there. That would be the logical implication, no?
Suffering exists.
Okay.
Whether or not we can intelligibly talk about it and construct beliefs about it.
But the problem is not the element of suffering. The problem is the element of ethics. What exactly tells you that suffering of another person is a bad thing? Or that it should be avoided?
Okay. If we're going to build a civilization,
okay.
Let's forget about religion. Let's forget about everything. Mm-hmm. Let's just say we have to build a civilization and we have to come up with a system of morality. And what else could you ground your morality in other than minimizing suffering?
So what do you do when you have two societies and one wants to dominate the other and exploit the other one for its survival? Where does morality play a role in that? And what exactly morality tells it not to?
Right. So again, in that case, you'd have to analyze how much well-being is being generated by each society.
But it goes, no, because that's irrelevant to the one dominating. The one dominating doesn't really care about the well-being of the one that's dominating. It just cares about its own benefits. If I'm benefiting at your suffering, why is that a problem? It goes back to Nietzsche's argument when he says that, he points out that if you're taking a naturalistic framework, the reality of a naturalistic framework, and Darwin frames it perfectly, survival to the fittest, let the weak die, let the strong live. That's what naturalistic biology tells you about the world. You know, the dominant animals, the prey kills the predators kill the prey. So why should that be different with humans? Are we not just another form of animals? Why exactly should we treat each other with compassion when it doesn't benefit us? What exactly in nature tells us we should do differently than what we observe in the animal kingdom?
Well, there's a number of ways in which we have evolved past our biological ancestors. For example, you know, somebody with bad eyesight 10,000 years ago might have some sort of handicap that would prevent it from spreading its genes to the next generation. But now people can wear glasses and contact lenses. And so we're outside a Darwinian framework, and we can talk intelligibly about being outside a Darwinian framework because of technology.
Well, I wouldn't say we're outside of it. Assuming it to be true, obviously I question if it's true, but assuming it to be true, assuming that the Aryan framework is the case, what exactly tells you that you're outside of it particularly just because you're dominating it? I would say you're in the hierarchy of it. You have the ability to put yourself in an advantageous position and dominate over everything else. But exactly what tells you that when it comes to morality or how you treat people, that it should be any different to what you observe? Why should it be different to what you observe? You know, even among humans, let's say the evolution of, let's say, warfare. Okay, we're still very much capable of killing each other, even if we have better technologies. You know,
Sure.
In the Middle Ages, even modern ages, like what's going on in Ukraine, all the wars across the world, the enslavement, you have the prostitution rings, even with kids. What exactly tells you that's wrong? Obviously, I think it's abhorrent, but that's coming from my Christian worldview. But if you're taking the Darwinian evolutionary point of view, and you're taking a naturalistic perspective, exactly what do you see in the naturalistic worldview that tells you this is objectively wrong, and how do you objectively define that?
The fact that suffering increases as a result of those actions.
Which goes back to the quick question of why is suffering, when it's done to someone else, a bad thing?
Okay, so obviously, I think hopefully my listeners are going to pick up on the fact that I'm steel-manning Sam Harris's arguments for moral realism. I don't actually believe a lot of this, but I mean, let's just
escapism to this argument.
Yeah, that's that. I lost. But let's just. I mean that. I agree with a lot of what you said, and I disagree with a lot of what Sam Harris says. But it seems to me, and like this is actually me talking. I mean, at some point, like when you get to the point in the conversation where you say, I don't remember like the last thing that you said, but you basically said something like, how can you intelligibly say that, you know, increasing suffering is bad morally or something like that? Like, isn't that kind of self-evident?
How so?
I mean,
in what sense?
Suffering isn't good for anyone.
We don't like suffering. That doesn't mean that it's good or bad.
But we want to avoid suffering.
Sure. But why does that mean that it's a bad thing to make someone else suffer when you prosper from it? That's the fact that you want to avoid suffering doesn't tell you why you should avoid having other people suffer at your own benefit.
Right, but everybody has to take. If human beings are social animals.
Okay.
And we want to live with other people, and so we have to learn how to live with other people, and that implies a universal morality.
The problem with that is what we see in social development, if we look at that purely as a social development, is that these rules of morality we create tend to differ significantly depending on what civilization you're part of. You look at the Muslim worldview, you look at the Christian worldview, you look at the, assuming that these religions are nothing but the product of social interactions, you look at these values differ significantly. Once upon a time, you look at the Aztec tribes, for example, where they were sacrificing old people because they thought that was going to get them a better heaven. You look at the Muslim worldview in a lot of the Muslim countries, where they're cutting off people's hands because they're stealing or they're executing people for criticizing Islam.
Mm-hmm.
You look at in Canada versus the States. You look at some states, the more conservative states, that are anti-abortion. The Canadian government wants to allow abortion up to birth. What does morality say anything about that? How does it differ so significantly if it's self-evident?
Right. So Sam Harris talks about the greatest possible suffering for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, every single conscious creature on the planet suffers as much as it can. Human beings, animals, aliens, AI, everybody suffers.
But isn't it self-contradictory? To say that you go from to avoid suffering, which is the logical argument that he's making, that it's moral because we know that we want to avoid suffering, and then he starts talking about how to put yourself in a situation where you're dealing with the least suffering as possible. How do those ideas coincide exactly? If you're trying to avoid suffering, if you're dictating that avoiding suffering is good, wouldn't that mean there's no circumstance where it's ever moral for any suffering to occur or to cause any suffering? Why didn't you give yourself the out of allowing suffering if it's for the greater good?
I mean, Sam Harris does make the distinction between suffering that's useless and suffering that results in personal growth or whatever.
But it contradicts his core assessment, which is that we're trying to avoid suffering and that's how we know it's good. That conflicts his primary argument.
That's not his core assessment. His core assessment is we should avoid the maximal possible suffering for everyone.
Okay. So how do you define maximal suffering?
Everybody is suffering as much as it can for no good reason.
And then the question goes back to why. Why should we avoid the maximum? Why should that be a framework? And
right.
How do you derive that as something objective?
So, again, I mean, that goes back to my earlier point, which is, isn't it kind of self-evident that we should avoid the maximal possible suffering for everyone?
How so?
I mean, what other priority could we have as a species?
For our own well-being at the expense of someone else.
Right, but that's part of the picture.
Well, it's part of Darwinian evolution. Does the predator care about the suffering of the prey? Or does he want to feed his belly and his kid's belly at the expense of the prey? Why should we be any different? What in nature tells us that we ought to be different if we're going off that framework?
But the maximal, in Sam Harris's framing, the maximal possible suffering for everyone includes predators, preys, everything.
Okay, and how you need to elaborate on that a little bit, because what I see is nonsense rambling without any clear, objective, concrete aspects to what he's pointing out exactly. It seems very idealistic without any practical expectations or practical applications. Oh, I want to avoid the most suffering. Okay. But it still doesn't answer why. If you look at a Darwinian evolutionary assumptions on the planet and you look what we observe in nature, what exactly the sciences tell us that we should avoid having our neighbors suffering for our own benefit? I mean, it's beneficial to us, right? Look at Kim Jong-un. His people are suffering. He's benefiting. He's a fat bastard who's eating well and doing good and no threat to his life right now. You know, he's living the best of his life. You know, if he dies, he dies. Darwinian evolution says he goes back to the ground like everyone else. Exactly why would he treat his people any differently if it benefits himself?
So again, Sam Harris would talk about the moral landscape and the peaks of well-being and suffering.
Okay,
in the
but
moral
exactly
landscape.
Where is he getting all this? I guess is the core question. And how does he know that any of it's true?
Okay, so there's this fundamental claim that Sam Harris believes in. We'll see if you agree with this.
Probably not, but go on.
I mean, I don't think you're going to have a choice but to agree. The circumstance that we're in right now is that we are conscious creatures that are capable of suffering and the opposite, right?
Okay, yeah, okay, that seems to be self-evident. Okay, then what?
Well, then, if we're going to have a system of morality that's universal, or that's real, or that's objective.
So if we're going to, so are we creating this system?
Well, the system already exists by virtue of the fact that conscious creatures exist.
Okay, so how do we know the system exists?
Because conscious creatures exist. There's nothing more fundamental than suffering.
So but I'm not drawing the link. How do you know that a system exists because conscious creatures exist? How are you drawing that link exactly? I don't see that link. What evidence are you basing yourself off to draw that link precisely?
The fact that suffering exists.
This is going back to circular reasoning. Suffering and consciousness existing doesn't mean that there's a universal system to how you deal with suffering. Where are we equating the two exactly? What in suffering and consciousness tells us that there's a universal system that we need to follow to avoid suffering?
It's something that every single conscious creature experiences.
Is it? Because when you observe conscious creatures and you observe social habitat, you don't see creatures that are worried about the well-being of others outside of their own close social circle. You see creatures that have, even among human beings, that have no issue naturally exploiting. Oftentimes morality comes from being taught stuff. But when it comes to natural instincts and natural inclinations, selfishness. Selfishness is anti-lack of suffering. Me being selfish, you see a homeless guy in the street, and you have the ability, you're living in abundance. Why should you sacrifice what you have to help him out? It's not practical to you. It doesn't increase. It arguably causes you suffering in order to help him out. So what universal law and what basic instincts do you have that drives you to do that exactly?
Okay, well, you're not giving me a choice.
Shoot your arguments.
I'm going to have to Straight from the horse's mouth. Okay, so basically, back when Sam Harris had Twitter, he basically posted a series of tweets in which he, starts with, facts, and then he gets to like values.
Okay.
Yes, and presumably you don't believe that we can derive values from facts, right? Is that fair?
Well, it's a very broad and imprecise statement. That's what I'm going to say to that.
Okay.
What does it mean? Like the statement in itself, it doesn't tell you much.
Well, I mean, Sam Harris would say that, it is a fact that we can suffer. It's a fact that everybody wants to avoid suffering.
But he's elaborating off that statement. What I'm saying is the statement itself doesn't tell you much. Now, the elaboration might, but the statement itself doesn't tell you much. That values can come from facts. Okay, that doesn't tell you much. It's a very broad and imprecise statement on its own. Now, if you elaborate it, obviously I could comment on it, but in itself, it's not very... doesn't tell you much.
Okay, well, I'm a little bit surprised by yours. I don't want you to think that I'm like trying to trap you or anything like that, but...
I'll shoot your shot.
So, people have debated Sam Harris publicly, obviously. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, and a lot of those people don't agree that you can derive values from facts. And so at some point, I guess, I always think it's got to be weird to be Sam Harris because you've got all these other people arguing against you, basically saying, well, what does it mean to say that we should avoid the maximal possible suffering for everyone? Which seems kind of self-evident, but, obviously there's flaws in it and that's fine. But anyway,
some serious flaws, but go on.
But at some point, Sam Harris posted a series of tweets, and he starts from facts and he gets to values.
All right, let's go over.
And the idea is what's wrong with this series of statements?
All right, go tweet by tweet and we'll analyze. And obviously, I'll wait for them to coincide. Right. We'll go tweet by tweet and I'll comment as needed, and then I'll comment.
Yeah. So you just tell me where you think he's making a mistake.
Okay.
Philosophical mistake. 1. Let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe.
Okay. Why would we need that assumption? Go on, but that's a question I'll ask.
So the reason he's making this assumption is because people keep saying, well, you can't derive values from facts. And so he's just saying there's only the facts in the universe.
All right, I'll let you go through the tweets and I'll comment.
Well, I do want you to point out where you think I'm making a mistake.
Well, it's not so much a mistake, but it's a question in response is, okay, why are we making that assumption? But go on, because any assumption should be questioned, right? Right, okay. So... all right, so there's only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. And that, okay. So, I'll be honest, I think that's his strongest argument. That there's nothing in the universe but facts, right? There's just what is. And so if we're going to have a system of morality, where else could we ground it other than in the facts? I mean, you could dispute that, but just go. All
right.
It's more like it's more of a side note than anything.
Among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds, susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. So far, so good.
Okay.
All right. Unfortunately, many experiences suck. And they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias. They really and truly suck.
Okay.
If you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back.
Okay.
This guy.
Fair enough. I guess it makes some rational sense.
Okay. All right.
Let's see where he goes with morality on that. But
conscious minds are natural phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
Consequently, if we were to learn everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, etc., we would know everything there is to know about making or corner the universe.
One side note, people with faith or someone like myself would disagree on that conscious minds are a natural phenomenon. I don't think they come from a natural source. I think we're created from a supernatural source, and that explains conscious mind. But anyway, go on. Just aside, I don't think that goes against really his core argument. But go on.
I mean, that's an interesting point, and I was half expecting you to stop me when I finished that sentence. But okay, well, I guess I'll keep going. If we should, he italicized should.
Okay.
If we should to do it, that's a typo. It might be from me, but if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks.
Okay.
If you consider this question begging, consult your stove as above. Of course, we can be confused or mistaken about experience. Something can suck for a while, only to reveal new experiences which don't suck at all. On these occasions, we may say, at first that sucked, but it was worth it.
Okay.
We're almost at the end. We can also be selfish and short-sighted. Many solutions to our problems are zero-sum. My gain will be your loss. But better solutions aren't. By what measure of better? Fewer things suck.
Is that it?
And then there's the last one.
Okay.
So what is morality? What ought, and ought basically just means should, right?
Yeah.
From David Hume. What ought sentient beings like ourselves do? Understand how the world works, facts, so that we can avoid what sucks, values.
Okay, I would say what part, his last statement is irrelevant to the rest of the statements. I don't see the connection. What he says, sorry, repeat it just so I can get it in my head.
So
the last one.
So what is morality?
Mm-hmm.
What ought sentient beings like ourselves do? So what should we do? How should we live? Understand how the world works, facts, so that we can avoid what sucks, values.
Which goes back to the fundamental questions I was asking earlier, is why is avoiding suffering, how does that objectively associate with morality? What does suffering have anything to do with? I mean, you can argue that morality is how you treat people, but what exactly in the naturalistic worldview tell you in how you should treat somebody, and how do you make the case that it objectively defines that you should avoid other people's suffering? What exactly in the natures of facts tells you that with absolute certainty?
Yeah, so there's I was kind of expecting you to say something like that.
I'm still waiting on an answer to that core point.
So there's this quote that I pulled from Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. It's a fun book. It's full of errors, but it's fun. This is a quote. Must we really argue that beneficence, trust, creativity, etc., enjoyed in the context of a prosperous civil society are better than the horrors of civil war endured in a steaming jungle filled with aggressive insects carrying dangerous pathogens?
I guess my core question would be, if I could have these things at the expense of someone else not having them and living in that second scenario, why shouldn't I? What does morality, what does his version of morality say to that, and how can he objectively define it? In other words, it's nice to say it's better to live in a good society than a bad society. Cool, a lot of people would, yeah, sure, why not? But isn't that the whole, isn't our human history really been the argument about how to attain that? You look at socialism. Okay, that was the experiment to try to get that to utopia. That was the utopia was under communism. Hey, cool. Let's take away the rich people's stuff and split it up among each other evenly, so we can all, with the intent of all getting to this utopia. What happened? How many million dead because people ultimately took advantage of that system, put themselves on top, and at the expense of the other people around it? I guess the core question is that's a nice sentiment, but what does that have anything to do with morality?
So it's a nice sentiment, but maybe it's not enough to build morality from or on.
Again, when you say build morality, that implies it's not there to begin with. To build something means that it wasn't there means that you're the one creating it. And that if you're the one creating it, that means it doesn't exist without you.
Okay, so this is a little bit of moral constructivist language sinking in. I don't agree with Sam Harris. I don't consider myself to be a moral realist, but I do believe that it is intelligible to construct moral values. I don't agree with Sam Harris. I think he's making the it-alls fallacy. And so, if this was Sam Harris sitting across from me, he probably wouldn't use those words, building morality. But yeah, so I guess that covers it.
I guess the reality is, when the minute that morality becomes built, it doesn't become, it's not relevant to everyone. Well, it can be relevant if they want it to be, but there's nothing objective about it at that point. It's not universal or objectively true. It's not fact-based. It's simply somebody, it's no greater than an opinion when you think about it. It's like saying, I like pepperoni pizza and you like cheese pizza. What does that tell you about, how do we know which one of us is right or wrong? We don't. It's an opinion. And when you're building morality, then morality stays to the level of opinion. The distinction, I guess I'll go quickly to the distinction between someone of faith, is I believe that morality is a set of rules that God created, or that God wants us to live by, that separates right from wrong. Now, obviously, I believe in the concept of grace and mercy, like I was explaining earlier, but biblical morality, or at least look at it from a Christian perspective, is there's a right and there's a wrong that God created, and you will be judged by it in the afterlife. So that regardless of whether you agree or not agree, regardless of whether you want to live by them or choose to live by them or not, there is going to be a justice at the end that's going to hold you accountable to how you live your life. So that lays the relevance of doing right and doing wrong. But you take that from a naturalistic framework, there's nothing that enforces at the end of the day. If I want to live well at your expense, what's telling me not to exactly?
Right. So I think it's intelligible to have system of morality again that are built or constructed.
But now you're in the
so I'm just going to finish this point. I was talking to my girlfriend yesterday about this, and the analogy that Sean Carroll makes in his podcast is that rules of basketball, they don't really exist out there in the universe, but we have to construct them. And the rules, I mean, on some level, the rules are arbitrary, but we do still have to construct them, and they do have to be intelligible. And if you're going to play the game of basketball, you're going to have to, play by the rules. And when I was telling that to my girlfriend who plays hockey, she's very Canadian, I brought up the example of hockey. And so, she started talking about how back then the rules weren't always the same and the equipment wasn't always the same, and they've had to make adjustments over the years. But, and that to me, it seems so analogous to how we construct morality. I mean, we try things that work, and okay, people that played hockey 100 years ago, they had like a really flimsy mask, and now they have something that's really sturdy. And so we try what works, what doesn't work. And so me personally, and again, that's not making any claims about objective morality. I think you can consider yourself to be, I don't think moral constructivists have to ground their morality in anything objective. I think Sam Harris is wrong.
So there doesn't need to be an end goal. There just needs to be an agreement.
Yeah, an agreement that, we should try to maximize human flourishing.
So in your eyes, so using that logic, if you take the morality that existed in let's say the South of the U.S., I believe in the 1800s when you had slavery, the fact that you had two classes of system, that the white were superior to black people, that is simply a different version of what you're proposing, equally as valid as yours, because you have no way to distinguish between the two. Or so, how would you distinguish between the two, and how would you claim that system invalid with yours being valid?
Right.
If there's no end goal, or there's no deciding goal, or there's no objectivity to it.
That's a good question. So I think there's a useful distinction to make between moral constructivism and moral relativism. So I think you and I would agree that moral relativism doesn't make a whole hell lot of sense. I think you and I would agree.
I would stretch that to constructivism as well, but go on.
Okay, well, let's just stick with relativism for a second. So if we look at a society in the Middle East or whatever, and they're putting their women in Sam Harris says bags, you and I would agree that it's bad. But if you're arguing from a strictly relativistic framework, you can't really say, well, that's bad, because you have to say, well, you have to take into account the context and the culture and this and that. But with moral constructivism, even though moral constructivists don't have an objective basis for morality, moral constructivists can choose to judge other cultures and say, okay, well, this is wrong because you're not playing by my rules.
Okay, but at the end of the day, this is nothing more than an opinion. And that's the point that I'm trying to get across, is that you might look down on somebody, but at the end of the day, what relevance is what you think in that situation? Because let's say you're not the majority, let's say you're a small group living in that type of system that you judge down upon. Okay, why is that relevant?
Why is what relevant?
Why is it relevant that you think they're doing something? Like, you can think they're doing something wrong. And I guess I'll bring it back to this. Constructivism, you say relativism says there's no way to distinguish between right and wrong. You say constructivism says there is a way to distinguish. But I'm saying the best constructivism to do is to say, I think this is right and wrong. They can't say it is. Because if they're creating it and somebody else is creating it, then there's nothing that says that the way you're creating it is any better than the way they're creating it. So whether they're creating it in a way that makes black people inferior to white people, and you're creating a way that there's equality, there's no distinction in the sense of saying, I'm doing something right, you're doing something wrong, because you can't distinguish between the two. They're just two separate systems living side by side. Where objective morality can say, yes, this is wrong, yes, this is right, because there's a framework that surpasses all of it.
Right, so I'm going to have to disagree.
Okay, on what basis?
Again, I mean, to bring it back to something a little bit more concrete, less abstract, basketball.
Okay.
Right? If you and I know the rules of basketball, we're going to play a certain way. But if we see somebody across the streets playing with, I don't know, a tennis ball, they're not playing by the rules of basketball. And despite the fact that there is no such thing as the rules of basketball out there in the universe, we can still say those people aren't playing right. They're playing wrong.
Sure, but the game of basketball is created.
Yeah.
I mean, well, actually, there's not many examples of sports being played with different rules, but there are different versions of sports. Let's say pool, for example.
Sure.
You play pool, okay, there's one version, you have one form of pool that's named to distinguish it, and then you have another version of pool. I don't know pool well enough to really, but I think to go off the example I'm going, there's basis to what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
That there's different ways people play pool or even poker. I think there's Texas Hold'em and so they distinguish the game based on the version of rules that they're playing.
Sure.
But if you take the game poker, now you have multiple versions of how to play the same game poker, because poker at the end of the day is a game people created.
Yes.
Okay. So you're saying, okay, there's only one way to play basketball. Okay, but what if they're not playing basketball? What if they're playing hockey?
Well, then they're not playing basketball.
Okay, but morality isn't basketball. It's broader than that.
Yeah.
Because if you're building morality and somebody else builds morality, how do you distinguish between the two frameworks? You're building the same thing, except you're building it differently. But how do you know you're building it right and they're not?
Well, that's the thing, right? You have to look at how people thrive and how people live and how people live their lives.
But now
in
you're
the two
looking for an
systems.
objective standard to it, which you, by your own admission, doesn't exist.
Why is that an objective standard?
It's an objective standard because in order to distinguish between the two ways you're building and say, you're not building this properly, I am, there has to be something higher that you're looking at to distinguish between the two. Because if there's nothing higher, and you're simply, okay, I'm trying to build the best system I can, or I think that works, and he's trying to build the best system he can anyway. On what basis are you saying that he's not building it right? How do you come to that conclusion exactly? Except that you believe that it's supposed to be built differently. That doesn't mean that it is supposed to be built differently. It means you think it builds differently. His thoughts of him thinking that it's supposed to be built that way was valid as yours. And when it comes to practical morality, it's essentially the equivalent of saying if you're going off constructivism morality, what they did, say, in Nazi Germany, what they did under the communist China and the communist regimes, what they did when the US with blacks and whites not being equal, that is the exact same thing as liberal democracy today. It's just a different version of it. What they had is as valid of a form of constructive morality as we do.
Nope.
It just looks different. Absolutely, because you have no basis to say that it wasn't.
Well, yeah, because we're constructing a morality that's different than theirs, and we can judge their morality because we're not relativistic.
But just because it's different, who says theirs is relativism? Why can't a constructive moralist landscape look like, I think whites are superior than blacks? Why can't it look like that? What stops it from looking like that?
I mean, it can.
Okay, so then how do you, from a constructive moralist point, look at another form of constructive moral points that says this and say, hey, you're doing it wrong? You can't.
Sure you can.
No, because you have nothing to distinguish between the two except to point out that it's different. You have nothing that says objectively that this is right and this is wrong. That's what objective morality is. To look at morality, to look at how you ought to treat a human being and say, this is the right way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it. You can't do that because you're the one creating it. If you're the one creating it, then it's as valid as somebody else creating it.
Right. Again, I think maybe it's a little bit abstract to deal in morality. Let's just go back to basketball for a second. If I have my own rules for basketball and somebody else isn't playing by my rules, I mean, it sounds like you're saying that because there's no objective basketball rules in the universe, that I can't make any claims about whether or not somebody is playing right or wrong.
I'm saying you can make whatever claims you want, but that doesn't mean they're relevant.
How would they not be relevant?
Because there's nothing but your opinion. It's the equivalent of me saying I like pepperoni and you like cheese. There's no way to distinguish it unless you're looking at an objective source. Because if you're able to build your own morality, why can't somebody else build their own as well?
I'm not saying that they can't.
Okay, and what if there's the morality they built implies that they treat women like crap and they treat black people as second-class citizens?
Then they're wrong.
Okay, how do you know that?
Because according to my own morality that I'm constructing, that isn't okay.
Okay, according to your morality. According to theirs, it is.
That's fine.
Okay, so why is yours right and theirs wrong?
Because I say so.
That's exactly it, right? It comes down, you and I can come, to you were talking about intellectual honesty earlier with the miracles. Mm-hmm. Can you be intellectually honest on this point and admit that constructive morality really doesn't tell you what's right and wrong? It's just a bunch of people coming together and agreeing what they believe to be right and wrong. That is the intellectually honest way to
You seem to think that there's necessarily something objective about morality, and I don't agree with that.
I'm saying that if it's not objective, then why is it relevant? Why do I care what a bunch of people think about me if it doesn't benefit me?
I mean, obviously, if you don't believe... If you believe in objective morality, you're not going to be convinced by the argument. But there's other people that don't believe in objective morality that have to try to figure out how to live in the world.
But I look at that as somebody who is coming from the outside of it, and I just look at that, and I come with a logical question. Okay, they believe this about the world. This is the morality they built. But I know that the only reason this morality exists is because they built it. Which means outside of them, this morality doesn't exist because they're the one that built it. So it's not really relevant. It doesn't tell me how to live. It's a way I could choose to live. It's a way that they believe people out to live. But it's no more significant. But if I see if I'm on the outside, let's say I'm looking at two tribes, two completely different way of building, two moralities they're building with. What tells me which one's the right way to go and which one's not? Nothing tells me this. There's one right way and there's one wrong way. They're both the same. They're just different. They're like different flavors of ice cream.
You keep saying that constructive morality isn't relevant. I'm not really sure.
Because it doesn't bring you, if you don't have one center, if you don't, like, let's take a moral question. Let's talk about abortion. Is abortion moral or not? Okay? Let's say there's a group of people that say it is, there's people that say that it's not. How do you know who's right? You don't know who's right under a constructive moral framework. They're both right in their own eyes. But that doesn't tell you whether you should or should not. I mean, depending on what group you listen to, you'll be guided in two different directions. But you ultimately don't have an answer to the core question. You don't have an objective answer to that question.
And nobody's claiming that there is an objective answer to that question
under
a constructivist framework.
As somebody who doesn't hold on to either frameworks, why should either of these frameworks be relevant to them? And if it doesn't benefit them, I guess the problem with constructive moral reasoning is that it's I guess you could follow it, or you might be led to follow it if there's benefit for you. Let's say you're head of a social class and you're using this morality, but let's say you make a morality in your constructive moral reasoning that says, okay, you shouldn't rebel against the king, and you're the king, and you benefit from that, then yeah, there's a practical implication for that. But what if it doesn't benefit you? Let's say this constructive moralism is based on people who hold a religious framework. Well, let's just say a practical framework, and they say, you know what, we don't think homosexuality is normal, and you're homosexual in that situation. What exactly convinces you to go by it when it comes in conflict with something you want to do?
Are you saying that the people claiming that it's wrong are constructivists?
Yes.
Okay, well then you have a conversation and you try to figure out who's right and who's wrong.
But you'd have no way to figure it out because ultimately you're both right and you're both wrong when neither of you are, actually technically speaking, neither of you are right.
Right, because you believe in objective morality.
Well, no, it's because if it is constructivism, there is no right and wrong.
Objectively.
Yes.
Right.
So you're just arguing different opinions. But I guess what I'm trying to say is to somebody, once that's been established, once you have a society that has a constructive moral framework, and you have somebody coming from the outside looking at it, and doesn't agree with it or doesn't align with what they want, why exactly should they follow it? It goes back to the example of Kim Jong-un, who's dominating people under him. You know, some people, some constructivism such as yourselves can go, okay, you know what, the way he's treating them is wrong, I believe is wrong. Okay, but why should he care? Because at the end of the day, both of you are going to end up in the ground in the same way. He's going to live rich, you're going to live the way that you are. He might benefit the way you live. Why should he change the way he's living?
Yeah, I think you're assuming that there is such a thing as objective morality coming in this conversation and then dismissing anything that isn't objective morality on the grounds that it's not objective.
I'm pointing out, well, it isn't objective.
Right, and nobody's claiming that it is.
Okay, but that's the exactly thing I'm pointing out. If it's not objective, you're admitting that it's not objective while pretending that it is.
Nope.
By taking another system and saying, okay, you know what, yeah, like I can understand how somebody can take the same ideas I do and make a system that I don't like. But no, that's not exactly how the system should be. How would you know? How could you argue that it's not? And what? I guess the how to quantify what I'm trying to say. Subjectivism is the same thing as constructivism in the sense that it, objectively, ultimately, it's irrelevant. To a intellectual mind, you look at a constructivism morality. There is no reason why I should follow it if it doesn't align with my own interest.
I mean, you can choose to be selfish if you want, but you're not going to make a lot of friends.
Okay, right? Well, no, it depends who I'm selfish to. I can be selfish towards you, but selfless towards someone else.
Yeah, and then they found out and they don't want to be your friends anymore.
Or they stick with me because they benefit from it.
Yeah,
that's what you see.
That's not going to last really long.
Is it?
I highly doubt it.
I definitely, well, it depends on what you convince of these people. Because I'm telling you, throughout different societies, there's a lot of different ways people choose to live. You know, like you said, you go to Islamic countries, you go to Western countries, you go to European countries, you go to African countries. There are completely different ways that they chose to. Their constructive morality is very different from one another.
Sure.
Okay, so exactly how do you go at it if you're stepping outside from all of them and looking at these systems individually? What logical conclusion do you come to otherwise saying they're different, but they don't really tell you anything about morality except what people want to live by?
Again, I think you're kind of assuming that there is such a thing as subjective morality, and
I'm just pointing out that there's not, which means that if there isn't, and it goes back to Nietzsche's argument, if there isn't, if morality cannot be objectively defined, if there's nothing in the world that says there is a right and wrong, then there isn't.
Objectively.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you could,
that we
no,
agree
there just
on.
isn't. There isn't. There. Objective means that it's true. There just isn't. That doesn't stop people from making it up themselves, but it doesn't make it true.
Again, I feel like we're getting lost in the abstract here, but
it's like, okay. I'll compare morality to religion. People are of the Muslim religion. People of the Buddhist religion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is it just because they believe the religion does it make the religion true?
I mean, depends how you define true, right?
No, it's not. Well, true. You know what? Are we
Literally
going to
true?
Yeah, I'm talking about truth. Does believing in a religion automatically make it true?
No.
Okay. Does believing in a set of morality automatically make it true?
If you mean literally true,
Yes.
I don't think that's the right way of looking at morality.
Why not?
How can something moral be literally true if it's not objective?
That's exactly the claim. They can't be true if it's not objective.
Right, but I'm not claiming that they're objective.
Okay.
Right?
Then why are they relevant?
We need to figure out how to live in this world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole enterprise of morality, right? That's the whole enterprise of ethics. So what could be more relevant to our lives than morality and ethics and figuring out how to live?
My own best life without worrying about other people that are relevant to me. That would seem like the natural point of view to look at it. If you look at Darwinian evolution, that's exactly what it seems to point to in that retrospect. Why should, if I'm the prey, let's say, well, take the natural observation, you have prey and you have predator and prey. The predator eats the prey, feeds his family doesn't look at him any different. He prospers, the prey doesn't. Why is that a bad thing?
Again, I'm not convinced that we're just nested in a Darwinian framework. I think we're a little bit beyond that. I think that there is a meaningful distinction between humans and animals.
What do you mean by meaning?
I think that the fact that we're self-conscious and not just conscious means that we can actually articulate moral systems of beliefs and trying to figure out how to live, which is not something that monkeys or wolves or fish can do, right?
I mean, they figure out their ways to live. You live in a monkey tribe, for example, a tribal state, or even a monkey tribe, or even a monkeys among themselves have a system that they live among.
But are you calling that morality?
I'd say no different. It may be a less complex form of morality, but the way you define morality or your constructivism version of morality, I see no different than what they do. They're determining a system to treat each other. One monkey's not going to kill all the other monkeys because he knows he's going to get killed in the process. The monkeys are finding ways to live with each other and coinciding and making a group of monkeys to prosper for their own benefit. Mm-hmm. The way you define morality seems to be exactly that. So how do they differ in that result precisely?
Nobody thinks of the way monkeys live as morality.
Why not? But what's based on your definition of morality? What's different?
When most people talk about morality, they're talking about how we should live in the world. And I think you would probably agree that animals don't have free will. They're basically biological robots, right? And so it doesn't make sense for us to talk about morality in animals if they're just robots.
Well, I would point out, I mean, from a Darwinian perspective, they're a different species than us.
Sure.
But they're life forms just like us. They have a conscious like us. They're less mentally developed like us, but they're a different species than us. Mm-hmm. But we're both biological entities, and ultimately, there's no core distinction except from a level of intelligence and the way our species appears and the way it reacts between us.
I don't know how to react.
That's what Darwinian evolution is. We ultimately came from them as a primate.
But do you believe that?
Do I believe that? Of course not. Okay. But that's what Darwinian evolution teaches. So that's the assumptions of Darwinian evolution. And naturalism, because naturalism has to rely on Darwinian evolution.
But even naturalists don't believe that there is no meaningful distinction between humans and animals.
Actually, so yes. Well, among naturalists, you have a bunch of different beliefs. You have some that believe that animals and humans are equal and that animals shouldn't be killed. So you have the personhood of animals, and that is a belief system among some naturalists. But ultimately, regardless of what a naturalistic individual believes, the logical conclusion of naturalism is that animals and humans are no different. Aside from the ability to aside from the intellectual abilities and the type of species they are. But put it this way, a monkey and a man are different in the same way as a monkey and an insect is. Or a monkey and a shark is.
Yeah, I think...
Men are not that significantly different than other species aside from arguably being more intelligent. That's it. This idea of our intellect creating ourselves some meaning and making us more important is nothing but our own imagination acting up, assuming Darwinian evolution to be true. There's nothing in objective science that tells us that.
I'm curious why you're arguing something that you don't believe in. Are you trying to, like, poke holes in my argument? Is that it?
Yes. Well,
okay.
It's rightfully pointing out the conclusions that have to come from this framework. Because oftentimes people of this framework try to go beyond it and argue, okay, you know what, I can create, this and that from it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm ultimately pointing out this is nothing but someone's ultimate own imagination acting up. If you believe this about the origin of the universe, this is the logical conclusion that you have to come to if you're being logical, because that's the reality of it. Now, my reality is different because the assumptions of reality are different. The assumptions of my reality is that we're not created by chance, that we're not monkeys evolved, and we don't come from primates, that we're created intentionally by God who created us from the dust of the earth, who created the world with intentions, who created man with intentions. I believe in morality because I believe that God loves us, that God created us with meaning. I don't think meaning comes from Darwinian evolution. I don't think it can. I don't think there's anything in Darwinian evolution that says man or any creature has meaning, because ultimately they live and die, and then they're true. There's nothing in the sciences that you concretely point out. I think you and I had this argument where I was asking you, where does meaning come from a perspective of Darwinian evolution? At one point you said it comes from our accomplishments. I said, does that mean that people who are mentally retarded who have little to no accomplishments are less valuable than those who have more accomplishment? Because if you're framing your value on accomplishments, then the value would fluctuate based on your ability to form these accomplishments.
Yeah, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. We can move on to
a different subject, but
I think
respond to that.
Meaning can be constructed intelligibly without any sort of objective reference to
my question.
Meaning.
I guess my only question to that would be, how do you derive, from a Darwinian evolutionary perspective, how do you derive concretely that you have meaning? How do you know that you mean something?
Because it means something to you. That's what it means to construct meaning.
Okay, but if meaning is relative, that means it really doesn't exist at all.
Objectively.
Yes.
Again, I feel like we're having the same argument as earlier.
No, because one we need to understand, when we use the word objectively, we're talking about truthfully. Objectively and truthfully can be coincided.
I mean, something can be subjective and true, right?
Well, I mean, I can believe that there's floating aliens. That doesn't make it true.
Right, but it's not objective.
Sorry?
Precisely.
It's
right.
not objective because it's not true.
So there's not a one-to-one correlation between objectivity and truth.
Absolutely there is. What's objective that's not true?
Right, so I'm not saying that everything that's true isn't objective. I'm saying that everything that isn't... No, sorry, I got mixed up. You're mixing me up.
No, but here's the question. I'm going to stick you to this question. What is objective that isn't true?
Right, I'm not... Let me think about that for a second. What is objective that isn't true? Well, again, I mean...
Give me an example.
Literally true?
Yeah, what is objective that isn't true?
I don't know that I believe that anything is.
Okay, so how do you know? So if morality is objective, then isn't it also not true?
Again, using the idea that truth means something that's literally true when talking about morality doesn't make sense. Why if not? You're talking about moral constructivism, because we're constructing morality.
No, but it does ultimately point out what moral constructivism doesn't want to see, or a lot of people moral construction doesn't want to see, is that what they frame as morality is nothing more than their own imagination and their own idealistics. But beyond that, it really is nothing. That's the point I'm trying to bring across. But anyway, we can move on to the...
Yeah, I think we should let our listeners draw their own conclusions, because, listen, there's a lot that I really wanted to go through with you.
I'm not in a huge rush, so if you want to...
I'm wondering if we could kind of go through this quickly.
Okay.
Like maybe we can start with the rapid fire rounds.
Sure. Start where you go. Jump where you want to go.
And like some of these questions are difficult, but I don't want to spend like a lot of time on like anything here. So let's see here. So what do you make of the apparent contradictions in the Bible? Do you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible? Let's start with that. Do you believe that the Bible doesn't have any errors or contradictions or any mistakes?
I believe the Bible speaks factual realities. I think you have to understand when you're talking about the Bible. You're talking about the modern day, say the English Bible or the French Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about translations from the original language.
Sure.
As far as I know, in the original language, we based the New Testament off 10 different copies. That each copy is partially incomplete, and we completed them using the 10 copies to get the final copy. Ultimately, what I will say is the scriptures from the canon all the way from Genesis to Revelation is consistent in its story, is factually true and inspired by God. That's the objective claim that I would make. Now, in terms of contradiction, I would ask for an elaboration on that specifically.
Okay, so on the point of the history of the development of the Bible,
Okay.
the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman talks about this in his book, let's see, Misquoting Jesus, New York Times bestseller. And basically, so here's a fact. So we don't have the originals of the New Testament, so they've been lost due to time. In fact, the oldest surviving copy of a New Testament that we have, it's called Papyrus P52. It's currently being housed in a university in Manchester, England, and it's believed to be dated to the, I think, 1st or 2nd century. But as far as the originals go, we don't have them.
I would have to go back because from what I understand, and I'm not a historian, but from the brief research I did, we actually have 10 original copies.
That's not what the consensus says in scholarship.
Then there'd be a debate on that for sure.
Are you talking about New Testament manuscripts?
New Testament specifically.
No.
Because the Old Testament's are well documented based on the Jews have had them for ages. But the New Testament, from memory serves, there was 10. They had 10 copies of the original manuscript. Each copy was incomplete, was missing some information, missing some passages. And using the 10 copies, they were able to complete each other and show a consistent manuscript going forward for what the New Testament says. Put it this way, there's not much people who disagree. You talk about the Bible in the New Testament. You're not going to get much disagreements on specific books about what it says. You'll be able to go back to its original language and get its original thing. The writings are consistent and that are consistently agreed upon what it actually says in terms of the original Greek.
Right, so even that's hotly debated.
Okay, well then you'd have to point out the specific examples of because to my knowledge that isn't debated. Or at least not debated among Christians, among people who actually believe in it.
Right, well I can tell you in scholarship, the fact that first of all, the fact that we don't have the originals, I mean, so a lot of scholars debate a number of things. As far as I can tell, scholars don't debate that we don't have the originals. Papyrus P52 is the oldest one so that's debated. According to a consensus of New Testament scholars, P52 is the oldest one that we have. And as far as variance goes, like there have been changes made to scribes over the years. Obviously, we haven't always had printing press. And so scribes either made changes by mistake. And so, sometimes a scribe would just kind of, with the stroke of a pen, an Omicron look like a theta or whatever.
So what mistakes are these in scriptures? Like what's the concrete mistakes?
Right. So before getting there, so there are, the current estimates for variant readings of the Bible, in terms of scale, it's a little bit to wrap your head around. A lot of these are insignificant, but the current estimates currently claim that the number of variant readings of the New Testament, this is kind of surprising, but it makes sense. There's more variant readings of the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament.
What do you mean variants of readings?
So differences in translation, passages that have been added to the Bible or deleted, theologically motivated changes by scribes over the years.
Like I said, if you go back to the original versions of it, you'd have what they originally said. If you go off translations, of course you're going to have, anybody can translate a document and misintrude what it says. That's true with any documentation. I can do that with the Quran, I can do that with any Buddhist texture. I can take what it says in its original language and its original date and make my own version of it and translate it to a different language. But the question is, can we go back to its originals, or can we go back to what we consent to be the original and make a consistent narrative there? Or in other words, essentially what the core question is, can I take a modern day Bible, point to a passage, and have no consistent agreement whether that passage is there or not. I guess, is there any objective examples of that?
No consistent agreement? You're saying you're talking about contradiction?
Either a contradiction within self, or a contradiction or a disagreement, or whether that passage is really there in the scriptures or not.
Right.
Like, is there a passage in the New Testament that's contested whether it was written or not by different sources? Does that actually translate to passages people not know if that's what actually this writer wrote or not? Because if for most of the New Testament was Paul who wrote it.
Was
Paul. The Apostle Paul wrote most of the New Testament. Most of the New Testament are letters that he sent to different churches.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And then you have John's on Revelations, and then you have, it's conflicted on who specifically wrote the Acts. Actually, people think Luke wrote the Acts to form a defense for Paul when he was going to preach the gospel to the Romans. But among these letters, these historical events are all consistent. So I guess going back to when you say inconsistencies or contradictions, what are we talking about specifically?
Right. So I'll give a few examples, but before getting there, I just want to point out the whole field of textual criticism in New Testament scholarship, which Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, is an introduction to textual criticism. The whole field is rested on the idea that we don't have the originals, and we're trying to reconstruct what the original words are of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus, some hypothetical sources that we don't have today, that Matthew and Luke drew sources from this hypothetical source called Q. And so anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. But as far as contradictions go,
I've read the entire New Testament. I can tell you that I've never seen any of these contradictions myself. I've seen consistent, even among different versions. Sure, you have different wording depending on the exact translation because you go to the original language.
Right.
But I've never seen any consistency in terms of any of the writings I've read in the New Testament, in terms of the narratives or what it says. There seems to be a very strong consensus in the consistency among the Christian worldview of what these letters actually say. Now, you can look at certain books that are denied by the canon of Scripture, and we'll go back into why. But in terms of what is accepted in the main Christian canon, which is the letters that Paul sent, Romans, Ephesians, Galatians, the Acts, Revelations. I think there's a few more. I know there was some added by the Catholics, but there's not much dispute. Nobody reads those and goes, "Oh, I'm not really sure on what part it's supposed to be there and what part it's not." It's pretty much unanimously agreed on. But I'm curious on what contradictions you would point out.
You're saying the unanimous consensus is that we know which parts should be in the Bible?
Well, let's take the book of Galatians. What distinctions lies in the book of Galatians among different versions?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty specific question that I couldn't answer, but...
Well, when we talk about contradictions and translations and different copies, you're essentially talking about the writings of the New Testament. The book of Galatians, or the letter to Galatians, is one of these writings. It is a letter sent by Paul to the Church of Galatians dealing with specific issues.
Sure.
So, taking that specific book as an example, does that specific book have discrepancies, and what discrepancies specifically exist when it comes to that specific book?
So,
or if you have another example to cite.
Right. So I'm not a New Testament scholar, so I can't give specific examples for specific books, but I do have some examples.
Okay, go.
So I think one of the most straightforward ones is we talked about it before we started recording, but the last words of Jesus on the cross.
Okay.
So in Matthew and Mark, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Okay.
In Luke, he says, "Father, into thy hands I come in my spirit."
Okay.
And in John, he says, "It is finished."
Okay.
How is that not contradictory?
Who says that? Do any of these scriptures claim those were the last words?
Yep.
Where does it say that? What's the passages on each?
I can tell you the passages, and I have a Bible, but basically after each of these words are spoken, it says, I don't remember the exact wording, but it's an expression, something about a ghost.
Okay, but that doesn't say, unless specifically mentioned this was the last word he said, and unless that's said on two different occasions, on two different wordings. The fact that they're jumping to what happened after saying these words doesn't specifically tell you that was the last thing he said. That was the last thing they documented him saying, or that they... But again, when you're telling a story, you'll talk about certain events, and you might leave out other events due to memory, or that's not where you put the emphasis. Doesn't mean that was never said. What my assumption is, or based on what you're bringing on that specific example, is that Jesus said all these three things. It just, which one he said was the last. isn't clear or might be clear in one of the Gospels. The point being, he said all three. It's just the last thing that the authors wrote about him was the specific wording in each of those specific chapters. It doesn't tell you that they're each saying that's the last thing Jesus said and that it contradicts each other. It's saying that's the last thing that they said he said. That's the last thing they recorded him saying, or that's the last thing they noticed that he said, or that they wrote he said, and then moved on to a different subject. You see this in different stories in the Gospels too. You see this, for example, with the parable of the vineyard.
Mm-hmm.
In one it says, let the first be the last. In one conversation it says, let the first be the last and the last be the first. And then he ends the conversation there and moves on to the next. And in another gospel, it specifically elaborates before he says that about the vineyard. So you see them giving different accounts where they're elaborating on each other what was said. That's not a contradiction. That's just specifying on different things and elaborating on different things where others are not.
So if it was said in the Bible that Jesus said X, Y, and Z, and then he died, and then somebody else said, well, he actually said A, B, and C, and then he died, isn't the most straightforward interpretation of that is that these words are his last and then he died?
No, because nowhere does it says that was the last words he said. It's simply the last words they wrote that he said.
But isn't that...
in describing the crucifixion, that's the last thing they said about the crucifixion before moving on to something else. Just because they didn't say everything he said and somebody else says something else that he said doesn't mean that he couldn't have said all three.
Yeah, but it seems to me like if you're taking the three sayings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you're just combining them, I mean, you're kind of creating your own gospel at that point.
No, you're not. You're actually incorrectly interpreting or reading into testimony, which is understanding that testimony in itself often isn't complete on one perspective. And oftentimes the way how, let's say you go crime scene detective, the way to get to a consistent narrative is by taking multiple testimonies and aligning them with each other and notice that specific details come out in certain testimonies more than others, and you're able to get a full narrative off all those testimonies, which is exactly what the Gospels are, the testimonial account. Just because the testimonial account doesn't mean they're going to say everything he did or said. In fact, the Gospels even imply there were things that he did and said that weren't recorded. They're going to record certain things that he did and said. Certain authors are going to record certain things that, or put emphasis on things that others have said. And it completes each other when you read all four. At least the parts of the Gospels that they want to bring to you.
So that's a good analogy. I want to stick to it. Let's say you're trying to figure out what happened before somebody died, and you have three testimonies.
Yeah.
And one of them says one of them says he said I like apples and then he died. And then somebody else says he said I like bananas and then he died. And then the third person says he said I like beer and then he died. Wouldn't the most straightforward interpretation of those three testimonies be those person are all saying his last words right before he died, and therefore they can't all be right?
If they're specifically implying those were his last words.
Right, which is what the gospel writers are doing.
But let's say he said those three words back to back, and each of them specifically picked out something specific that stuck to them, and didn't mention the rest. That wouldn't necessarily mean a contradiction, which could be a potential conclusion. Now, when it comes to the Gospels, again, why I say, and I know we're a little strapped on time, so that's why I don't want to put too much emphasis on the into, but that's what I would respond to is I would look at each of these scriptures. What specifically does it say, and does it specifically in all three imply, or at least in two of the three imply, this was the last thing that he said, or is it simply the last thing that the specific author wrote that he said before they documented that he died? Because if it's the last thing they reported that he said before he died, that doesn't mean he didn't say something else after. It just means they didn't record it before moving on to what else they wanted to say. That doesn't imply a contradiction.
I mean, would you agree that it's a less plausible interpretation to say, well, actually, no, they said his words and then he died, but they didn't actually mean to say those were his last words? No, I think what I'm responding
is very plausible, and unless you could point specifically in the scriptures where it clearly says differently than that, where it clearly is saying this is the last thing he said, and at least two of them are saying this is the last thing he said, and they differ in the last thing he said, then I would point to you, okay, that's a concrete contradiction. But if you can't pinpoint that specifically, I would say what I'm saying is very plausible in regards to that. Especially how none of them contradicted on anything else that he said, and have all remained consistent. I think it's a bit of a far-fetched to point to that one specifically as a contradiction. I don't see it as a very credible argument.
Right, so you're telling me if a detective comes to you and says, your friend before he died said, I like bananas, and another detective said, no, like before he died he said I like apples, you wouldn't see a problem with that?
I would wonder why the hell he's saying I like bananas before he dies. I think that would be the question. I think that would be the more the center around question in regards to that.
Right, but that's not the point.
No, but to pinpoint the point you're going at, no, unless they're implying it was the last thing he said.
But they are, because they said the word, this is what he said, and then he died.
No, but well, you're talking about a direct witness account after the fact. But what if this was documented 10 years later? What if somebody writes a story about something 10 years later? And
Well,
says,
then
yeah,
it's more prone to error, right?
assuming there is error. But that's an assumption that there is error.
But why would you assume that there is no error in the Bible?
Why would I assume there's no error? Because I have no evidence to believe that there is.
But if you assume that there is no error and there actually are, like, wouldn't you be blind to that fact?
Why would I be lying?
Because you're assuming something that isn't true.
I mean, my core question is, can you point out that specific error? The example I'm saying, you're giving, with all respect, in my opinion, is vague.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fine. Like, obviously, you can come up with a lot of, like, people...
Well, I feel that my response to it is fair, right? Unless you can pinpoint to me where it specifically says this was the last thing you said.
Yeah, and I'm not claiming that they're saying that.
Okay, well, if they're not saying that, then my response to say that it could be that what they were documenting, they documented as the last thing he said, but that may not have been the last thing he said. That may be the last thing they put emphasis, and that it's seen in other places of scripture where certain things he said, they didn't say everything that he said, with other people finishing what he said. That this could be another example of that. It would be consistent with the testimonies, what else they've said on other accounts. So why wouldn't it be consistent there?
Okay, I'll just move on to one more example. In two different Gospels, it is said that Jesus dies on different days.
What's the passages?
Right, so in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is said to have been crucified on the day after the Passover meal. And in the Gospel of John, he's said to have died on the day before the Passover meal.
What's the passage? Let's look it up.
So Mark 14:12.
Mark 14.
So in Mark 14:12, it is established that they're preparing for the Passover meal. Or
on the first day of the festival, unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus supposed to ask him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to the Passover?" Wait, you said Mark 14:12?
Yeah, Mark 14:12 to Mark 15:25. So in Mark 14:12 establishes the date, and then the next day in Mark chapter 15, he's said to have died at the third hour.
Where do you want to go and make preparations for you to Passover? So he sent two disciples, telling them, "Go to the city, and a man carrying a jar of water." Okay. Disciples left, went to the city. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." When he was eating with me, they were silent. Okay. I would say this account, when it comes to the Passover, this account would have to be consistent though. On the first day of the festival, unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asking him, "Where do you want us to go to make preparations to eat the Passover?" They ate the Passover the day before the crucifixion. The night of the Passover is when he was betrayed, brought, and then the following day is when he was put on the cross.
So you're saying he was crucified after Passover?
It was because they sacrificed, if memory serves, and you can correct me in historical, they ate the Passover. That is when Judas betrayed him. Yeah. Judas betrayed him after the Passover. He went and prayed for his disciples at that night, because they were praying that night after the Passover. After they ate the Passover, after they were praying that night, that was the night he got captured. They came to him, and then you had the different accounts where you find out that his ear was cut off, and you find out it was Peter who had the sword. Jesus said, "Leave him be. If I wanted to stop him, I can." He goes willingly. They interrogate him, and I believe it was the morning of that day that he gets crucified.
Right. So in the Gospel of Mark, it's the day after the Passover meal, and in the Gospel of John, it's the day before the Passover meal. So that's one contradiction.
Okay. What does John specifically say?
I mean, I have it here.
Okay. What does John say?
It was the preparation of the Passover.
Mm-hmm.
And about the 6th hour. I mean, that's another contradiction, right? The hour, but we can forget about that. And he said unto the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." So again, this was while they were preparing for the Passover. So this was before the Passover meal. Pilate said unto him, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then deliver him therefore unto them to be crucified.
Repeat that. I know there's a clear. No. I know there's a clear answer to it.
Just at the bottom there. John chapter 19. At the bottom.
Okay. And it was preparation of Passover and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king," but he cried out, away from, crucify him. Pilate said to them, "Shall I I would have to, honestly, off the bat of my head,
Right.
I would have to go deeper because I know the story is consistent that he ate the Passover meal of the disciples before they captured him. That is consistent biblical narrative.
In Mark.
Sorry?
In Mark, he eats the Passover meal and then he gets crucified. No, if you look at it from a historical
point of view, that's what's acknowledged to have happened.
Well, from a historical point of view, you would just have two contradicting testimonies.
I would have to go deeper. I would have to go back and go deeper.
Okay.
Something doesn't seem to line up on that.
That's
Again,
fine.
it's hard to answer on the spot because you obviously don't know this.
Right.
But something from a historical point of view doesn't line up with that. There has to be an explanation of why that is.
Yeah, if you assume that there's no errors in the Bible, you have to come to that conclusion for sure.
Or you logically assume, why would they make a narrative error like that? There's the logical question too.
Right, well, it doesn't have to be intentional, right?
No, but the question goes into, because John would have ate the Passover with Jesus.
Right, so here we're assuming that John wrote his gospel.
No, but think about it, okay? You have accounts going in.
Mm-hmm.
John eats the Passover. You have at least two of the disciples that said, two of the ones who wrote the gospel, actually three gospel accounts that would have said John was eating the Passover with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So why would John then, his account be different in that regards?
That's the question.
Now either that's a very simplistic contradiction, or there might be more to what John says, or there might be a specific, what John was saying, there was something specific to it. Listen, I'll come back to you. I'm sure there's an explanation.
Of course.
Something doesn't. I don't buy that as a contradiction. I believe there's an explanation, and I'm sure with a bit of digging on myself, I'd be able to find it without any issue. That there's an explanation behind what he's saying.
But it seems to me like, I mean, they can't both be true.
Sorry?
Both accounts can't be true because one of them says Jesus was crucified after the Passover meal, and the other says he was crucified before.
It didn't say he was crucified before. He said when they were preparing the Passover that he was in front of them.
Which was before.
That's what. Sorry.
So they were preparing the meal, so they didn't have the meal yet.
What if it wasn't?
But it says that it was.
But what if what he says that it's not implying that it was before the Passover? What if there's a different reason he said that?
When you prepare for something, that
that
something
would be
hasn't
the
happened yet.
logical interpretation when you read it off the first glance.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is, there might have been a different reason he said that. And again, the logical reasoning goes, there was 3 disciples that witnessed them eating the Passover together before he was captured. So all other accounts agree on that. So why does his differ? That doesn't make any sense. Because they're shown to be consistent testimony between all 3 of them. All 3 of them testify in the crucifixion. All 3 of them testify in his words. For him to something doesn't add up in that. So my bet would be that upon a bit of digging, there's a reason why he says that aligns with everything else they say. That would be my assumption. Now, again, give me about an hour to do some research, and I'm pretty sure I can get an answer to that.
No rush. But, I mean, I guess the question here is why, I mean, again, if you have 2 accounts that both can't be true, why would your assumption be, no, they're both right, I have to do research?
But I gave my answer to that is, give me a bit of time to do research, and I'll find you the reason why he said that is consistent with what they're saying. I don't believe that, I believe on first glance that appears to be a contradiction, but I'm rather confident there's a grounding reason behind it.
Right, so but that's what I'm fishing for. If there appears to be a contradiction, why would you still assume that there isn't one?
Well, do you mind if I do some quick research on the spot? I know we're a little strict on time, but if you don't mind me looking it up, I can pull you up an answer. Or give you, again, these questions on the spot, right? I don't know the scriptures off the top of my head. And
that's fine.
The scripture. So when it comes to contradiction, I think the fair thing before you establish that something a contradiction, before somebody misses a contradiction, that they would do some delicate research and dig in a little more to the subject before going off a glance of what they're reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
sure.
do you want to do research at the bat, or do you want to move on and then I'll come back to you at a later time and we can add that?
I mean,
if there's
you can come back to me later.
Okay.
That's totally fine. Yeah, I realize there's so much that we haven't gone through.
I mean, we can do a part 2 too if you want to do it down the line. I
would actually like that.
Do you want to do a part 2? I think can come back. We can end it here, and I can come back with an answer next time.
Maybe we can finish with some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
What's your favorite Bible verse?
That's a good question. You know what? No, actually, I know the answer to that. Or at least it's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
It's for God has used it. This is in is it Galatians or Corinthians? I think it's Corinthians. Paul says, "For God has used the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He used the weak things of the world to shame the strong." And I forget exactly how the last part goes, but basically glorify His name. And the reason why I love that verse so much is because it speaks about my own life, where I'm an individual. I guess I'll say it on stream. I have very low grade, what is probably accurately considered autism. It's really called nonverbal, but it functions it's a neurological distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So my mind functions very differently, and I struggled a lot with my identity, who I was, my strengths, my weaknesses, and basically some of the strengths that come out because of the way my mind functions has been things in my life that God has been used to glorify His name. So to see how God has been used the way that I'm different, that verse brings a lot to me.
All right. Have to find like the best ones here. My God, there's so many good ones. Have you seen? I'm curious to hear what you guys say. Have you seen the epic biblical drama by Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ?
Yes.
What do you think of it?
I saw it a couple of years ago.
Okay.
I don't have much memory of it, to be entirely honest. But I remember my mom telling me when she saw it, she was crying at the end of it, and I heard Jehovah's Witness friend was as well.
Oh wow.
Honestly, from what I've read, from what I followed through, and from what I saw, I'm glad. I believe that he was influenced by God when he did it, and it got people to see, what Jesus really went through. For the sake of it brought a realness to the story of the cross for many people.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I heard he's making a sequel right now, Mel Gibson.
He was part of the what's that? Sound of Freedom.
The actor, right? The
actor was part of the Sound of Freedom.
Okay. Who's your favorite Christian apologist?
I mean, I ran through this before, but I have to go. Rabbi Zacharias won my faith when I was young, or was a massive inspiration, so I would go with him, especially from the apologetics field specifically. Right. Because he's specifically known for his apologetics.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm a fan of William Lane Craig. So he's the founder of reasonablefaith.org, and I think he makes some pretty compelling arguments. So yeah, I'm not much into apologetics, but when I do, usually it's Craig. What do you make of people that take psychedelics, like psilocybin or LSD, reporting mystical and religious experiences?
I think you can go on the level of delusion, which is when your brain doesn't function the way that it's supposed to. Your brain can create things that aren't real. We see it with schizophrenia, with voices. We see it. And that you can argue there's definitely a level, in some cases, of demonic possession, which is something that I believe in. That's a whole subject in itself.
Right.
But yeah, I think that drugs screw your mind, makes you say things that aren't really there, and I think that's pretty much explains their experiences.
Okay. A trolley is running down a track where 5 people are tied down.
I've seen this.
You can pull a lever, but the lever would be directed and would kill one person.
No.
Do you pull the lever?
No.
So you'd rather let 5 people die?
I'm not killing 5 people. I am killing one if I flip that lever. It's not my place to take a life to save 5.
All right. No,
there's another version of the story, and I like the way they phrase it. It's basically, it comes down to organ harvesting. It's just 5 people there's one person with 2 organs, there's 5 that not do kill, and then I essentially raise the question, well, what's different? The only difference I see is one you're flipping a switch, the other one you're harvesting organs, but they're essentially the same moral action. Yeah, that's my way of seeing it. But from a moral, I guess it separates the Christian morality versus the world's morality, or the individual's morality, which is a Christian morality, versus the greater good mentality. Is the greater good will see I save 5 lives at the expense of 1. The Christian morality is I'm not justified in doing wrong even if it brings that good out of it, because I'm not God. That's the distinguish between the 2 ways of seeing it.
Makes sense. To what degree? I'm gonna skip this one.
Why? Long question.
To what degree is it useful to be a smartass in a debate?
How do I answer this? I don't say it's useful. I think it's fun. I think that would be a real. I think. Look, I'll be very honest. When I'm arguing people. Yeah. Not saying that you're the kid. I mean a little bit, but no. When you argue arrogant people, there is some satisfaction in coming to a point where you're shutting them up, and you know you're shutting them up because they don't know how to answer you, and you just see that pause in their face. I find some satisfaction in that. Right. Now, is it practical? No.
To be a smartass?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Interesting question, though.
To what degree are you a smartass?
I mean, more than I should.
All right.
Put it this way, I strive for truth. I care to defend what's important to me. I want to do it in a way that reflects the heart of the one that I serve.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way that there's humility, but also in a way that there's passion, and that you're not just sitting there taking hits. That you're defending. When you defend someone, you're defending them. But when you're on the front line, when you're used to defending, or when you have a calling for that, like myself,
mm-hmm.
You have to have the thrill of the fight. You have to have an enjoyment of it, because it is draining. You also have that draining. You also have that, it takes a toll on you when you're constantly in those situations. But it's like, you have to have something that carries you in that situation. And I think that's where, like, sometimes I notice, and my sister has pointed out to me, I'll debate, and when I get a point on something, I'll give a smirk, like,
yeah.
But it's like, it's kind of like sporting, You're going hunting, you're getting that deal, you take the shot, and you're satisfied.
Right.
Because that's where it comes from. That's the drive that lets you do it. And, like, it correlates with you always being there, because that's how you're able to stand out being there. Because not everyone can always be in these situations. It takes a toll on you, and you need something to be able to endure that.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to your earlier point about the importance of character, right? In the way that we behave, and especially men, but women too. So if you were to come on my show again, is there anything that you'd like to talk about? Obviously, we can go over contradictions again, but
yeah, that's specific, Bruce.
that one contradiction.
I'm definitely coming back to that.
Because there's, like, me personally, there's a lot that I wanted to cover, and, like, obviously we had a good talk, and I'm not complaining. But is there anything, like, if you were to come back, is there anything that you, like, want to explore or talk about?
That's a good question. I mean, I can come back to you. I don't know off the bat of my head if I can give a clear answer to that, because I mean, the important things to me, the core important thing to me is my faith.
Right.
That's, if there's one thing people look at me, like, I hold conservative values. I believe in conservative politics for the most part, anyway. Obviously, COVID is absolute nonsense for biblical reasons, but the core of it is, I'm Christian. These are my values. This is what I stand up for. This is what I want to push people to, because I think that it would transform their life, because it transformed my life, and because I'm convinced that it's true. So if anything, I want people to come out of my life, it's that, about that I worship God, that I worship the God of Scripture, and that's the one that I stand by above everything else.
Yeah, probably a good place to end it. All right, well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And
shake this guy's hand.
No, honestly, like, this has been really fun. And if you ever feel inclined to come on my show again, don't be shy.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we left it kind of pending on. But yeah, definitely. We'll talk.
Right. Maybe do another 3-hour show.
Oh yeah, it's almost midnight.
Yeah. But
hopefully my parents don't see this.
Yeah, we started this at 5 p.m. The recording.
It's 9 o'clock, right, Joe? It's 9
o'clock. Yes.
Yeah, perfect time for me to go back and feed the dogs. Yeah, thanks.
All right, man. Thanks a lot for making the time. I've really enjoyed this, and best of luck with everything.
Thanks, man.
All right.